On a quiet April morning in 1912, the world awoke to a piece of news so shocking, it seemed impossible to believe. A ship once called unsinkable had vanished into the cold Atlantic, leaving behind questions, grief, and a mystery that would haunt generations. This is what happened after the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves. A night of indescribable shock. The world wakes up on April 15, 1912. The first whispers began just after midnight. Scattered pieces of information drifting through the wires of the world's telegraph offices like stray embers in a rising wind. At first, nobody understood what they meant. A message here, half a line there. A ship sending distress signals in iceberg. A collision. And then silence. It was still dark across most of the world when the news began to take its earliest shape. In New York, operators on the night shift leaned forward in their seats, adjusting their headphones as the faint Morse pulses tapped through the static. In London, half-asleep clerks rubbed their eyes as the ink on the telegraph paper began spelling out a story that none of them were prepared to believe. In Paris and Berlin, in small coastal towns along Newfoundland, and in the wireless rooms of ships scattered across the North Atlantic, the same puzzling fragments echoed again and again. Titanic. Collision. Assistance needed. Situation critical. But it wasn't until dawn approached that the messages changed tone from confusion to dread. Sometime around 5 a.m. in New York, the first headline draft was scrawled in black ink on a newsroom chalkboard. Titanic struck iceberg ship in distress. The editors argued fiercely about whether it was too dramatic or not dramatic enough. The Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable. It was the newest, grandest, most luxurious ship the world had ever built. It was the pride of British engineering and the dream of every ocean ships simply didn't vanish in the North Atlantic in 1912. Not something like the Titanic. So, the first instincts of the journalists were cautious optimism. It must still be afloat. Help must be on the way. It could not possibly be worse than it sounded, but the wires kept ticking. And with every new message, that optimism faded like smoke in a cold wind. The world wakes slowly and then all at once across America. The morning of April 15th began like any other Monday. In quiet neighborhoods, milkmen rattled bottles on porches. Horses clopped along cobblestone streets. Children dressed for school. Mothers prepared breakfast. And factory workers hurried through the early chill toward another long shift. Most people had never even heard the first rumors during the night. Life was moving along, steady and unaware. If someone had walked down a street in Boston or Chicago or Philadelphia at dawn, they would have seen nothing unusual at all, no sign that history had just changed course in the cold black waters of the North Atlantic. But inside the newsrooms, inside the telegraph hubs, inside the shipping offices, something electric was building. The typewriter keys were striking faster. Editors moved in sharp, urgent strides. Telephone bells rang as quickly as trembling fingers could dial them. Every scrap of information, every word felt like it carried the weight of the world. At 7:30 a.m., a new message crackled through from the Allen Line's Virginian. We are proceeding to the site. Titanic sinking by the bow. Sinking. Not damage. Not stalled. Not taking on water. Sinking. It was the first time the word appeared that morning, and it sliced through any remaining illusion that the situation might improve. Still, there was denial, powerful, human denial. This was the Titanic, after all. If any ship could survive a collision, it was this one. But the telegraphs were relentless. Cold, mechanical, unemotional. And then a single message arrived that felt like a blow to the chest. Titanic has foundered. In other words, she is gone. America feels the shockwave bite. The news was finally spreading beyond the office walls. Newspapers rushed out early editions with bold black letters that seemed to shout from street corners. People gathered in tight clusters, craning their necks toward bulletin boards where new updates were pinned. Every few minutes, some looked confused, some refused to believe it, and some stood perfectly still, as if their bodies had forgotten how to move. Everyone had a reason to be shaken. There were the wealthy, families whose sons and daughters were aboard the ship. There were immigrants who had friends traveling in the third-class cabins, people who had sold everything for a chance at a new life in America. There were those who simply admired the ship, had followed its construction, or had dreamed of sailing on it one day. The Titanic had captured the imagination of the world even before she left Southampton. To lose her on her first voyage felt like a cruel cosmic mistake. Factories briefly paused their machines so that supervisors could read the latest updates aloud. Offices stopped their work. Schools received visitors' relatives showing up, pale-faced, asking if they could take their children home early on the wireless sets that existed in a few lucky homes. Listeners leaned in close to the speakers, hoping for good news. But hour by hour, the truth pressed heavier on their hearts. Nobody wanted to say the word dead. Nobody wanted to even think it. But it hung in the air, unspoken, unavoidable, on the other side of the world. Similar scenes unfolded in London. People arrived at work to find crowds already gathered outside the White Star Line's headquarters. Men removed their hats and held them against their chests. Women clutched handkerchiefs in trembling hands. There were no names posted yet, no lists, no official confirmations, just the vague, dreadful knowledge that something unspeakable had happened. In Belfast, where the Titanic had been built, the shock cut even deeper. Hundreds of ship workers who had spent months riveting steel plates, laying deck beams, and polishing brass fittings now stood silent in the shipyard. They had watched the Titanic rise from nothing into something magnificent, an engineering triumph, a creation they were proud to call their own. Rumors of her sinking felt personal, like the loss of a child. And in small European villages, where families had waved goodbye to husbands and sons boarding the Titanic for a better life in America, the silence was even heavier. Many of them didn't receive news through newspapers or telegraphs. They heard it spoken aloud in trembling voices, or in church courtyards, or from travelers arriving with grim faces. The world wasn't just shocked, it was grieving. A strange, uncertain morning what made April 15th such an unforgettable day wasn't only the tragedy, it was the confusion. For hours, there were conflicting reports. Some newspapers printed that the Titanic had sunk, but that most passengers were saved. Others claimed she was badly damaged, but still afloat. A few even suggested she was being towed to Halifax. Nobody had the full picture. Nobody knew how many had survived. Nobody knew who had made it onto the lifeboats. Every update brought a new wave of hope, then fear, then disbelief. In New York, families hurried to the White Star Line's office on Broadway, desperate for information. Employees fell, exhausted, overwhelmed, scribbled updates on chalkboards, then erased them minutes later as new messages arrived. The crowd grew so dense that the police had to push them back to keep the street clear. Some people stood quietly, staring up at the windows like statues. Others whispered prayers. and a few simply collapsed in grief, unable to remain standing under the weight of uncertainty. The cold reality begins to set in by midday. There were more messages this time from ships that had reached the area. They confirmed what the world feared. There were survivors, yes, but far fewer than anyone had imagined. Lifeboats had been sent out half empty. Many had been lost to the freezing sea. And then came the message that turned shock into something deeper and far more devastating. Carpathia has on board approximately 700 survivors. No others found. That number felt like a knife. 700 survivors out of more than 2,000 people. Newsboys sprinted through the streets shouting the words nobody wanted to hear. In homes across America, people sat down slowly, hands covering their mouths, and around the world, something shifted. The Titanic disaster wasn't just a tragic accident anymore. It was the kind of moment that stops time, the kind that forces humanity to look inward and question everything it believes about safety, technology, and the future. People begin to ask questions. Why were there so few survivors? Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why didn't nearby ships come? How could the greatest ship in the world die on a calm night under clear skies? These questions didn't have answers yet, but they would soon ignite investigations, debates, and reforms that would reshape maritime history. A night the world never forgot. The time night fell on April 15th. The shock still hadn't worn off. In major cities, people gathered in churches for impromptu candles flickered in windows. Families sat together quietly, listening to the radio or watching the streets outside for the next newspaper boy. The world had awakened that morning to a rumor. By evening, it was living inside a tragedy. And still, the story was only beginning. The survivors were still at sea, heading toward New York. Their testimonies had not yet been heard. The investigations had not yet begun. The arguments, the blame, the reforms, the discoveries, all of that still lay ahead. April 15th, 1912, was not the end of the Titanic story. It was the moment the world realized this would be a story that would echo far beyond a single night. A story whose shadow would stretch across generations. The heroes of the rescue. The arrival of the RMS Carpathia at 12:25 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, while the Titanic was already fighting for her life in the freezing black waters of the North Atlantic. Another ship was quietly cutting through the night, far to the south. Her passengers were asleep, her decks were still, and her wireless operator, Harold Cottam, was just finishing his shift. The ship was the RMS Carpathia, a modest Cunard liner known more for dependability than luxury. She was built for comfort, not speed. No one on board had the slightest idea that history was about to call upon them. Cottam had slipped off his headphones and was getting ready for bed when he caught a faint message drifting through his receiver, a message that wasn't even meant for him. The Titanic's operators were sending private traffic to a nearby station. And out of habit, Cottam put his headphones back on, just to listen a little more. He didn't have to. He wasn't on duty. He could have ignored it. But that tiny moment of curiosity, that split-second decision, changed everything. He tapped out a message to the Titanic almost casually, as if checking in on a friend. "MGY, do you know that Cape Cod is working you?" He expected a routine reply, maybe even a playful complaint about the noisy wireless traffic that night. Instead, the Titanic's reply came like a punch. "Come at once. We have struck a berk. It's a CQNY. D. CQD distress. Emergency. Not a drill. Not an error. The Titanic, the largest ship in the world, the unsinkable marvel of modern engineering, was calling for help. Cottam froze, staring at the message. Then he ran, literally sprinted, through the ship, bursting into Captain Arthur Rostron's cabin without even knocking. "Sir, Titanic is in distress." Rostron's decision, Captain. Rostron didn't waste a second. Some men hesitate, asking for more information. Others need time to plan. Rostron simply acted. He bounded out of bed, pulled on his uniform, and immediately ordered the Carpathia turned north, directly toward the Titanic's last known position, more than 58 miles away. For a ship like the Carpathia, that was a tremendous distance in icy waters. Even at top speed, it would take hours. And the Titanic didn't have hours. Maybe not even one. But Rostron didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he had to try. He called his officers to the bridge and gave a flurry of orders with a calmness that would later become legendary. Shut down hot water to divert steam to the engines. Turn off all heating except where absolutely necessary. Prepare lifeboats and rig them for rapid deployment. Set up medical stations across the ship, dining rooms, smoking lounges, first-class cabins everywhere. Boil water for hypothermic patients. Ready stretchers, blankets, bandages, and food. Post extra lookouts to scan for icebergs. And then, most dangerously of all, full speed ahead. Every man on the bridge stared at him. Full speed in iceberg territory in the middle of the night. But Rostron repeated it. "All the speed you can, Mr. Dean." The Carpathia's engines roared as they were pushed far beyond their intended limits. Later, engineers would swear the ship had achieved speeds she had never reached before, speeds they believed impossible. Rostron's orders bordered on reckless bravery, but he made one thing absolutely clear. Take every possible risk if there is a chance to save even one life. And with that, the Carpathia charged into the night. The race against time passengers aboard the Carpathia awoke around jam 3:30 AM to an eerie combination of sounds. The engines pounding harder than usual, boots scuffing quickly across the wooden deck, voices shouting orders. They emerged in night robes and coats, confused, asking each other the same question. "What's happening?" Officers gently explained. "Titanic has struck an iceberg. We are going to her aid." Some passengers gasped. Some prayed. Others simply stared into the darkness, trying to imagine a giant like the Titanic in distress. It didn't feel possible. The Carpathia surged north through waters littered with ice. The sea glistened with eerie white shapes, growlers, bergs, and floating sheets the size of houses. Lookouts strained their eyes until they burned, pointing out dangers with frantic gestures. Rostron stood firmly at the bridge, refusing to leave, focused entirely ahead. Every passing mile felt heavy. Every minute felt like a loss. At around 4 a.m., the first pale suggestion of dawn began to tint the sky. The stars faded slowly, and the North Atlantic revealed itself, silent, cold, indifferent. The Carpathia pressed forward, her bow slicing the water with desperate urgency. Then, at 4:10 a.m., they saw a green flare exploding in the distance. A signal, a lifeboat, survivors. The Titanic was gone. But her people were still out there. The first lifeboat, the Carpathia, drew closer. As the morning light grew, the sea filled with small, bobbing shapes, lifeboats, scattered across miles of open water, each carrying men, women, and children who had lived through the unthinkable. The first boat approached the Carpathia side around 4:25 a.m. It was lifeboat No. 2, carrying a group of women who looked almost ghost-like. They were silent, stiff, wrapped in cloaks and coats against the bitter cold. Some were crying softly. Others stared blankly ahead, unable to process what had happened. Rostron personally helped them aboard. He tried to offer reassuring words, but most were too numb to respond. A few whispered the same question again and again. Is my husband here? Did you find the others? Are there more ships coming? And Rostron, with a heavy heart, could only shake his head. Behind the first lifeboat came another, and another, and another. For the next 4 hours, the Carpathia hauled survivors from 20 lifeboats onto her decks. The passengers, who had been sleeping hours earlier, now handed out blankets, coffee, soup, and warm clothes. They wrapped shivering children in their own coats. Some gave up their cabins so exhausted families could rest. The number grew, 20 survivors. 40. 100. 200. And with every lifeboat came new stories, each more heartbreaking than the last. A sea of griefta. Carpathia's decks were soon crowded with people in shock. Some looked outward at the sea, as if hoping the Titanic might still appear. Others broke down entirely, collapsing into the arms of strangers. Survivors reported everything. The collision, the panic, the cold, the music the band played, the dark shape of the Titanic's bow rising into the sky before it finally disappeared. One woman fainted as soon as she stepped aboard. Another kept repeating, "My baby was in the other boat. My baby was in the other boat." A young boy asked quietly, "Is the big ship coming now?" Nobody had the heart to answer him. Dr. McGee, the Carpathia's doctor, treated frostbite, shock, hypothermia, and wounds. But the emotional wounds, the grief, the guilt, the terror, were far harder to soothe. A group of men who had survived were haunted by the fact that they had lived while others had not. Mothers wept quietly for husbands left behind. Children cried for parents who would never come. Rostron walked among them, checking, comforting, offering reassurance whenever he could. But even he could not escape the weight of the day. No more boats at 8:30 a.m. A final sweep of the area confirmed that no more survivors remained. Cold silence surrounded the Carpathia, the Titanic's entire resting place. The site where the greatest ship ever built had vanished, now held nothing but drifting ice and the scattered memories of thousands. Rostron ordered the Carpathia to turn toward New York, carrying 705 survivors, the only survivors. The journey back was slow and emotional. Survivors stared at the horizon, silently grieving. Some gathered in groups to pray. Others retreated alone to empty cabins, unable to face the world yet. The Carpathia had become more than a rescue ship. It had become a floating monument to tragedy. Ship that became a legend when the Carpathia finally reached New York. The world hailed her as heroic. Newspapers called Rostron the captain of the century. Survivors spoke of the crew with gratitude that bordered on reverence. The Carpathias, pasillos, ordinary travelers who had suddenly become part of history, were praised for their kindness and bravery. But those things came later. On the morning of April 5th, while the world was just beginning to understand what had happened, the Carpathia's crew was living it minute by minute, hour by hour, rescuing, comforting, carrying the weight of unimaginable grief. They were the first to witness the survivors' tears. They were the first to hear the stories of that terrible night. They were the first to bring hope into a morning filled with sorrow. They were, in every sense of the word, heroes. And yet, as the survivors slowly settled into borrowed blankets and borrowed clothes that day, none of them knew that this was only the beginning. Ahead lay questions, investigations, controversies, decisions, and decades of fascination. The Titanic story had not ended at sea. It was about to unfold on land, and the world would be watching. Landing in New York, grief and media frenzy on American soil. When the RMS Carpathia finally reached the outer edges of New York Harbor on the evening of April 18, 1912, the city was already transformed. The docks, the streets, the rooftops, even the water itself seemed to hold its breath. Word had spread far and wide that the survivors of the Titanic were on their way. And New York, a city already alive with noise, motion, and ambition, had gone strangely, almost eerily still. From Battery Park to the piers of Chelsea, thousands of people lined the waterfront in the cold rain, clutching umbrellas and newspapers soaked into pulp. Families who had spent 3 days in agonizing uncertainty stood shoulder to shoulder with curious crowds. Government officials, reporters, photographers, and even passing onlookers who had simply been unable to stay home. Cars jammed the streets leading to the Cunard Pier. Police shouted orders that dissolved instantly into the roar of the crowd. In all the city's long history, New York had never waited for a ship the way it waited for the Carpathia. Somewhere out on the dark water, a horn echoed. Long, low, mournful. People strained their eyes, searching the horizon. Then, slowly, through the mist and rain, the Carpathia appeared. Her silhouette glowed faintly, haloed by the lights of the accompanying vessels. Tugboats surrounded her. Like guardians, some blew their whistles in salute. Others rang bells in solemn acknowledgement of the tragedy she carried. And as the ship drew closer, something unusual happened. The crowds quieted. What had been shouting, crying, praying, and shouting again now softened into a trembling silence. Thousands of people no longer acted as individuals, but as a single, unified witness to grief. The Titanic's survivors were coming home, but not the way anyone had imagined. The Carpathia enters the harbor. Streaked the decks as Captain Rostron guided the Carpathia toward Pier 54. Survivors huddled near the rails, wrapped in blankets and borrowed coats, staring at the sea of people waiting for them. Some cried softly at the overwhelming sight. Others stood rigid, clutching life jackets, mementos, or nothing at all. A few whispered, "Do they know? Do they understand how many we lost?" Yes, and no. The world knew the numbers, but it did not yet understand the grief. When the Carpathia passed the Statue of Liberty, the survivors fell into a deeper silence. For many third-class immigrants, this had been the symbol of hope, the dream of a new beginning. Now it felt like a reminder of who was missing. Husbands, wives, children, friends, gone, forever tied to that cold, black night at sea. Some survivors stood trembling as they looked at the famous torch, imagining what it would have felt like to arrive on the Titanic as planned, in triumph, with laughter, excitement, and celebration. Instead, they arrived in Morning, a city overwhelmed on shore. Reporters had been camped out for hours. Some had not slept since April 15th. Every newspaper in America, and many abroad, had sent their fastest writers, artists, and photographers. Wire services prepared to transmit stories the instant the survivors stepped off the ship. Flashbulbs popped in bursts like distant lightning. But the police held everyone back. The Carp had orders. No press allowed aboard. No interviews. Not yet. The survivors were too fragile. The situation too raw. Captain Rostron had insisted that the dock be cleared for medical personnel, officials, and families only. But controlling the crowds was almost impossible. As the ropes were thrown ashore, the enormous mass of people surged forward, desperate for any glimpse of the survivors. Above the chaos, loudspeakers crackled, attempting to deliver order. Stand back. Families only beyond this point. No reporters passed the barricade, but fear and grief ignored rules. Families searching for names in the crowd. One woman clutched a photograph of her husband so tightly that the frame had cracked. She had been at the pier since dawn, whispering his name to anyone who passed by. Nearby, a young boy gripped his mother's skirt, searching every lifeboat passenger with wide, hopeful eyes. At the very front of the barricade stood the families of the wealthiest passengers. Reporters tracked them with feverish attention. The Astor family, waiting for news of Colonel John Jacob Astor, the Thayers, the Ryersons, the Whitingers, the Strauss family, whose matriarch, Ida, had refused to leave her husband Isidore behind in the sinking. Tensions rose as crewmen began lowering gangway. Survivors slowly made their way toward them, guided gently by Carpathia staff. The first to disembark were the injured, carried by stretcher, wrapped completely in blankets, faces pale and hollow. Some people reached instinctively toward them, desperate to offer help, comfort, anything at all. But the saddest moment came when the White Star Line posted its official lists. Survivors, missing, dead. People lunged toward the boards. Some scanned the lists with shaking fingers, others with tightly held breath. Then the sounds began: faint cries, then louder wails, then full-throated grief. A mother collapsed onto the wet pavement, screaming her daughter's name. A man bent over the railing, covering his face with both hands. A young woman simply sat down where she stood. Unable to move, New York had become a city of mourning. Reporters racing for stories. Despite the restrictions, reporters found ways to get their stories. Some bribed crew members. Some yelled questions across the barriers. A few even hired small boats, approaching the Carpathia from the water, shouting up at the passengers crowded along the railings. Did the ship break in too? Were the lifeboats full? Was it chaos? Did the band really play as she sank? Survivors looked down at them with empty eyes. Some answered softly, compelled by the need to speak their pain aloud. Others turned away, unable to relive what they had seen. A few, overwhelmed, broke down mid-sentence. Every detail, every quote, every tearful moment was immediately scooped up, sent down the wires, and printed in bold headlines across the country. Survivors tell terrifying tale. Women and children first. Thousands lost. Heroic band played to the end. It was a media frenzy. unlike anything America had ever witnessed. Inside the Carpathia still, many survivors didn't leave immediately. Some were too weak. Others hesitated, afraid of what waited for them outside. Grief, questions, and a future without the people they loved. In the first-class lounge, women wept over telegrams that confirmed their husbands were gone. In the dining room, children clung to nurses, asking again and again, "Where's Papa? Is he on another boat?" Some survivors refused to speak. Some spoke non-stop, too shaken to stop. Many simply slept, truly slept. For the first time in 3 days, Captain Rostron moved among them, offering comfort with soft words and gestures. He was praised endlessly, thanked repeatedly, called a hero again and again, but he carried the weight silently. He knew that no amount of bravery could undo what the sea had taken. A nation watching as survivors trickled down the gangway. The atmosphere around the pier grew thick with emotion. Policemen were crying. Reporters were crying. Dock workers, rough, hardened men, wiped their eyes as families reunited or broke apart before their eyes. One man wrapped his arms around his wife and 2 children, all of whom had survived in separate lifeboats. The family clung together wordlessly, trembling with relief. Another woman approached every child who passed, hoping one might be her missing son. Finally, when the last young survivors descended, and her boy was not among them, she fell to her knees in the mud and rain. People rushed to help her, but nothing could break through her grief. Small acts of kindness, not all moments were tragic. Some were unexpectedly tender. New Yorkers rushed forward with blankets, coats, warm hats, sandwiches, hot coffee, anything to help. Cab drivers refused to take payment from survivors. Hotels opened their doors for free. Churches rang their bells in mourning, but kept their doors open for comfort. A little girl handed a survivor her favorite doll, saying softly, "You can have her. Maybe she'll help you." For the first time since the sinking, the survivor smiled. The world turns toward answers. As night fell, the grieving city slowly spread the survivors across hospitals, hotels, and private homes. But the questions remained loud, sharp, and relentless. Why weren't there enough lifeboats? Why was the wireless operator asleep on the Californian? How did a ship like the Titanic sink so quickly? Who was responsible? These questions didn't have answers, not yet. But soon they would demand them. The landing in New York did more than deliver survivors. It ignited the spark that would lead to the American inquiry, the hearings, the testimonies, and the historical reckoning that would follow. The Titanic story had crossed the Atlantic. Now, it was America's turn to face it with grief, anger, and determination. And somewhere behind the closed doors of government buildings, preparations were already underway. The immediate call for answers. Why the U.S. demanded an inquiry. The shock had not yet settled over America when the calls for answers began to rise quietly at first, like murmurs under a blanket of grief, and then louder, sharper, almost desperate. It was the morning after the Titanic's sinking, and although the RMS Carpathia was still several days from reaching New York, the American people had already decided one thing. They would not accept mystery as an explanation, not for a disaster of this magnitude, not for a tragedy involving hundreds of American families, and definitely not for a ship that had been marketed across the country as the safest vessel ever built. In the newspapers of April 16, 1912, grief and outrage shared the same page. Headlines screamed without saying much at all. Titanic lost, only 700 survive. Many notable Americans gone. But below the bold, trembling letters, journalists admitted what nobody wanted to read. We do not yet know what truly happened. We do not yet know who is responsible. We do not yet know why so many died when the ship carried lifeboats for so few. And this uncertainty didn't sit well with a nation that prided itself on engineering industry and the triumph of modern progress. America, with its growing confidence on the world stage, suddenly felt betrayed by an era that had promised safety and delivered tragedy instead. By midday on April 16th, politicians in Washington were already sensing the rising storm. Senators read the early telegraphs from New York with tightening jaws. Business leaders whispered anxiously among themselves. Even President William Howard Taft, who had lost his own close military aide, Major Archibald Butt, in the disaster understood the scale of what was unfolding. The Titanic was not just a lost ship. It was a blow to the American belief in unstoppable advancement. There was also something more practical, more urgent. The Titanic was a British ship under the British Board of Trade's authority, but a significant portion of the passengers were American citizens. Many of the wealthiest names in the casualty list belonged to Wall Street, New York society, and American business circles. These families were not going to sit quietly while London handled everything behind closed doors. And so the question rose across the country. Who will tell us the truth, if not us? Senator William Alden Smith, a man known for his sharp instincts and an even sharper dislike for corporate negligence, sensed his moment. He recognized that the Titanic disaster was not just a maritime tragedy. It was a cross-Atlantic scandal waiting to explode. And he was determined to be the one holding the lantern when the doors finally opened. On April 17th, as Americans crowded train stations to buy newspapers faster than they arrived, Smith announced what the public had already been demanding. The United States would conduct its own investigation. Not a discussion, not a polite diplomatic exchange, a full Senate inquiry. Journalists lit up instantly. Editorials praised the decision as bold, necessary, patriotic. Families of the lost clung to it like a lifeline. For them, the inquiry meant accountability. It meant someone, somewhere, was going to dig past the vague telegraphs, the rumors, the corporate assurances, and the carefully crafted public statements coming from the White Star Line. Because by now, something unsettling was becoming clear. The story being told by officials did not match the scale of the destruction. Survivors, though still at sea, had sent fragments of testimony that chilled the public. There were not enough lifeboats. Third-class passengers struggled to find the decks. The wireless operators had missed or ignored warnings. Ice had been sighted hours earlier. Even worse, whispers reached the newspapers about another ship, a mysterious vessel that reportedly saw the Titanic's distress rockets but failed to respond. These rumors triggered a deeper suspicion that someone, somewhere, had failed catastrophically. America's grief was slowly turning into anger. Senator Smith understood the emotional temperature perfectly. He framed the inquiry not as an attack on Britain, nor as an intrusion into another nation's business, but as a moral imperative. Modern technology had failed. Human decisions had failed. And in those failures, more than 1,500 people had died. He argued that the United States, with its citizens gone and its reputation for fairness, had every right to demand accountability. Behind the scenes, however, Washington moved with unusual urgency. Telegraphed instructions flew to New York. Detain key witnesses. Do not allow the White Star Line's executives to leave the country. Ensure the survivors can be questioned before the media storms take over. It was a bold set of directives, and it signaled something America had never done before, launching an international investigation before the bodies had even been recovered. Meanwhile, the public kept asking the questions that newsmen could only repeat, not answer. Why had an unsinkable ship been so vulnerable? Why were there lifeboats for barely half the passengers? Why did so many crewmen survive while families perished? Why were survivors describing confusion, disorder, and mixed instructions from officers? And perhaps the most painful question of all, could more people have lived? Every hour, new details arrived, each one intensifying the need for official answers. Some papers reported that the Titanic had split in two. Others claimed it had sunk intact. Some said the band had played until the end. Others called it fiction. Some insisted Captain Smith had gone down heroically. Others accused him of negligence, without clarity from the shipping company, which seemed reluctant to speak. Doubt filled the silence. Senator Smith understood that answers could fade, memories could blur, and truth could be lost unless action was immediate. The Carpathia was due to dock in just 2 days. When it arrived, the world would erupt in chaos. Reporters, families, photographers, and curiosity seekers, all converging on a single pier. If the inquiry was not in place by then, the survivors would be swept away before they could testify. Thus, Smith pushed through the authorization with remarkable speed. Within hours, a Senate committee had formed. Subpoenas were prepared. Rooms were secured in New York's Waldorf Astoria for immediate questioning. The machinery of American justice, slow under normal circumstances, was suddenly sprinting. Back in New York, the public's grief sharpened into a national mood that demanded clarity. Churches held vigils. Families waited at the pier as if the sea might change its mind and return their loved ones. Across the city, telegraph offices remained crowded day and night with people desperate for news. Even businesses paused. Banks observed moments of silence. The stock market slowed under the emotional strain. And in Washington, the inquiry's purpose grew larger than anyone expected. It was no longer just about the Titanic's final hours. It was about the future of maritime safety, about corporate accountability, about the trust people placed in technology, and about whether human arrogance had led to preventable death. Senator Smith later said he believed the Titanic disaster was a warning from fate. That might sound melodramatic, but the sentiment reflected the national mood. The country felt betrayed by a world that promised progress but delivered devastation. And if America did not demand answers, then who would? When the Carpathia finally reached New York on April 18th, the Senate team was waiting, not with anger, but with solemn duty. They moved through the crowds with notebooks, stenographers, and a quiet determination. Their mission was not simply to question survivors, but to capture history before it slipped into speculation. The call for an inquiry had begun as a reaction to shock, but now it was something greater. A promise. The United States would uncover what happened. It would preserve the testimony of the living. It would examine the actions of the White Star Line. And ultimately, it would ensure that the dead were not lost to silence. For in the aftermath of tragedy, clarity becomes a kind of justice, and America was determined to deliver it. Senator Smith's spotlight. The American investigation begins. Senator William Alden Smith had always been a man who moved with purpose, but on the morning of April 19th, 1912, there was something different in his stride. Something sharp, almost electric. The RMS Carpathia had docked the night before, delivering the shivering survivors of the Titanic's final hours, and Smith knew that the world's attention had shifted squarely onto him. Every camera lens, every journalist, every newspaper editor, from New York to California, was waiting for him to step forward and begin what many were already calling the most important investigation of the century. He had barely slept. His hotel room at the Waldorf Astoria, now transformed into the headquarters of the Senate inquiry, was filled with papers, telegraphs, notes, and lists of names. Survivors to be questioned, crew members to be detained, officers whose testimonies would shape the world's memory of that terrible night. The responsibility weighed on him, but it also stirred something inside him. This was no ordinary political duty. It was a moment that demanded clarity in a nation drowning in rumor, fear, and grief. Outside the hotel, crowds surged like restless tides. People wanted to see the survivors. They wanted to hear the truth. They wanted confirmation that their loved ones were gone, or the miracle that they were somehow still alive. The streets felt tight with emotion, heavy, almost suffocating, and Senator Smith could feel that weight pressing against the windows of the inquiry room. He straightened his notes, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. This was not just an investigation. It was history being written under the eyes of a grieving nation. The inquiry began that afternoon in New York, even before the Senate committee formally arrived in Washington. Smith insisted that it start immediately, while memories were raw, while witnesses were still in shock, while the noise of the world had not yet had time to distort the truth. He believed that testimonies taken too late would be softened, reshaped, or influenced by fear, pressure, or corporate manipulation. And he wasn't wrong. The White Star Line had lawyers already circling like sharks, preparing defenses, adjusting narratives, and drafting statements that minimized blame. Smith wanted none of that. He wanted the story as it lived inside the minds of those who survived. The first witness he called was a tired, pale wireless operator from the Carpathia, Harold Cottam, who had been the one to receive Titanic's distress call. His voice shook not from fear of the committee, but from exhaustion. He had slept barely a few hours since the rescue. His hands trembled as he described the moment he realized the Titanic was in trouble. "I received the message at about midnight," he began, swallowing, "and I wasn't even supposed to be at the receiver." The room stiffened. Smith leaned forward. "What do you mean, Mr. Cottam?" "It was a chance," Cottam said softly. "I was checking personal messages for the passengers, and then I heard the Titanic's call. If I hadn't been listening." He hesitated, the thought too heavy to finish. The implication hit the room with a cold, sickening clarity. If Cottam had gone to bed early, hundreds more might have died. Senator Smith wrote furiously. His mind raced. A ship worth millions, carrying thousands, had been left vulnerable because the illusion of invincibility made even simple precautions optional. If the Titanic had truly been unsinkable, then why maintain strict wireless monitoring? Why prepare for disaster? Why equip the ship for a world in which accidents still happen? As Cottam stepped down, journalists scribbled manically, capturing every word for the morning papers. And Smith knew these early testimonies would set the tone. This inquiry was not going to be gentle. It would not be polite. It would not protect reputations. it would dig. Next came the survivors, men and women still shivering in clothing borrowed from Carpathia passengers, their faces pale and hollow, their voices unsteady. Some spoke as if they were still hearing the screams fading into the night. Others broke down before they even began. Smith listened carefully. He asked direct questions, but always with a strange blend of firmness and compassion that surprised even his critics. He understood that what he was pulling from these people was not just data. It was trauma, the kind of trauma that lived deep in the human mind, fragile and easily distorted. One woman described the confusion on the deck as officers shouted contradictory orders. Another described being locked behind gates in third class. Claim the White Star Line strongly denied. A young man recounted the horror of the ship's final plunge. The massive hull rising out of the water like a black tower before breaking apart. Smith asked for details, timelines, clarifications. He wanted precision. The world was watching, and this inquiry could not afford vagueness. But when he called up the surviving officers, everything changed. Light footsteps echoed sharply against the polished floors. Second Officer Charles Lightler, the highest-ranking surviving officer of the Titanic, walked into the inquiry room. He carried himself with rigid discipline, his face pale but unreadable. He had already gained a reputation among survivors as a strict and disciplined officer, and now he stood before the senator with a composure almost too steady for a man who had survived the sinking of the century. Smith studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Officer Lightler," he said, "please recount the events of April 14th and Lima Blas as you experienced them." Lightler inhaled, his jaw tensing. He began with precision, describing watch changes, iceberg warnings, sea conditions, and the calmness of the ocean that night. He spoke with the clipped, polished formality of a career seaman, each word measured, controlled, almost rehearsed. But Smith was no stranger to witnesses who hid pain behind professionalism. When Littler reached the moment of impact, the scrape, the shudder, the terrifying quiet, the room leaned in. For a brief second, his voice faltered, but he pushed through, recounting the orders, the launching of the lifeboats, the chaos, the cries. Then came the question everyone knew would arrive. Why were the lifeboats not filled to capacity? A silence fell over the room. Lightler's throat tightened. "Because," he said slowly, "we followed the principle of women and children first. In some cases, we could not find enough women and children at that moment to fill the boat." Smith's eyes narrowed. "Officer, do you mean there were empty seats left in multiple lifeboats, even as hundreds waited below?" Lightler hesitated. His composure flickered, his breath catching for a moment. His answer was calm, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. "Yes, Senator, some seats were left empty, but we acted under the understanding that the ship would stay afloat. There was no panic at first." The words hit the room like a second iceberg. Journalists scribbled furiously again. Survivors stared in disbelief, and Smith felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, a mix of frustration and grim determination. The Titanic had not been run with urgency. It had been run with confidence, a deadly confidence. But the most anticipated moment of the inquiry came when Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, entered the room. Ismay did not walk so much as glide, his steps quiet but overly deliberate, as if trying to minimize his presence. He looked exhausted, humiliated, even haunted. The newspapers had already crucified him, calling him Coward Ismay, the man who let women die, and worse. But Senator Smith wasn't interested in theatrical rage. He wanted answers. While cameras snapped and pens scratched, Smith's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Mr. Ismay," he said, "did you pressure Captain Smith to maintain speed, despite iceberg warnings?" The room froze. Ismay swallowed. "No, Senator, absolutely not." And yet survivors claim the ship was traveling nearly full speed when the collision occurred. Ismay's fingers twitched. "That is standard practice, Senator. The Titanic was built to withstand collision." A murmur rippled through the audience. There it was, again, the myth of invincibility. The belief that technology had conquered nature. The belief that human error was no longer dangerous in the age of steel and steam. Smith leaned back, observing the man carefully. He knew Ismay was defending more than himself. He was defending an entire corporate empire, an industry worth millions, and the pride of British shipbuilding. But the senator was not intimidated. Through hours of questioning, he slowly peeled back the layers. Why so few lifeboats? Why ignore other ships' warnings? Why were distress rockets misunderstood by nearby vessels? Why was the Californian silent? Each question widened the gap between myth and truth. As the inquiry continued through the week, it began to shape a new understanding of the disaster. Testimony by testimony, fragment by fragment. Senator Smith was reconstructing the Titanic's final hours like a massive broken puzzle. He discovered that the lifeboat requirements were outdated, that wireless communication was unreliable and poorly regulated, that officer training was inconsistent, that corporate pressure shaped decisions at sea, that safety was treated as optional in the age of luxury. The Titanic's sinking, he realized, was not one catastrophe. It was a chain of them, each link forged by overconfidence, underregulation, and misplaced faith in progress. Every day, the crowds grew larger. Every morning, the newspapers printed full pages of testimony. America followed the inquiry like a serialized drama, each witness a new chapter, each revelation a twist. J. Bruce Ismay, under scrutiny. The White Star Line's fate. When J. Bruce Ismay stepped into the inquiry chamber on that pale April morning, the air seemed to hold its breath. His name had already traveled across the world in headlines dripping with accusation, curiosity, and a bitterness that only grows in the shadow of tragedy. To many Americans, he had become the living symbol of corporate ambition gone awry, the face of a company that built an unsinkable dream and then watched it crumble into the Atlantic darkness. He arrived wearing a carefully tailored suit, but even the immaculate stitching could not hide the exhaustion etched into his features. He had not slept properly since the night the Titanic went down. His eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped slightly, and his movements were slow, as though he carried the weight of the ocean itself on his back. Yet there was also something else, a faint spark of defensiveness, the fragile remnants of a pride that had once been much stronger. Ismay was a man accustomed to respect, influence, and quiet authority, but none of that mattered anymore. Here, in this room, filled with senators, survivors, journalists, and grieving families, his status meant nothing. He was no longer the powerful chairman of the White Star Line. He was a man on trial before the court of history. Senator William Alden Smith watched him enter, and in that moment, he understood exactly what the public wanted. They wanted answers, yes, but they also wanted accountability. Someone had to stand at the center of this tragedy and answer the unanswerable. And whether fair or not, Ismay was the only man left alive who represented the decision-makers of the White Star Line. Mr. Ismay Smith began, his voice steady but cold. "Please take your seat." Ismay lowered himself into the chair cautiously, as if sitting were a negotiation. His fingers trembled slightly before he clasped them together, willing them to stillness. 1,000 camera lenses and pencil tips leaned toward him. The questioning began almost immediately. Smith's tone was formal, but there was a deeper edge beneath the veneer. The edge of a man determined to strip away corporate polish and extract truth. "Mr. How many iceberg warnings did the Titanic receive in the hours before the collision?" Ismay shifted, eyes flickering downward. "I believe 6, Senator. 6 warnings," Smith repeated, letting the numbers settle over the crowd like dust. "And did you discuss any of these warnings with Captain Smith?" Ismay swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I spoke to the captain after one of the messages. Yes, but merely in passing." "In passing," Smith raised an eyebrow. "A ship full of passengers receives multiple warnings of ice, and the conversation was merely in passing." A murmur rippled through the audience. Ismay straightened slightly. "The captain was experienced, Senator. I trusted his judgment." Perhaps he intended that statement to sound respectful. Instead, it sounded like a quiet retreat, a surrender of responsibility, cloaked as humility. The questioning continued. Hour after hour, Smith pushed through layer after layer of corporate decisions, safety regulations, design choices, and public promises. He wanted Ismay to confront the truth. The Titanic had not been prepared for an accident, not fully. And if the ship had been built under the shadow of the White Star Line Embison for grandeur, then Ismay stood in that shadow too. One exchange struck the room like a slap. "Mr. Ismay," Smith said evenly, "why did the Titanic carry lifeboats for barely half its passengers?" Ismay inhaled carefully. "The ship complied with Board of Trade regulations, Senator." "That is not an answer," Smith replied, his voice sharp but controlled. "The Titanic was the largest ship afloat, yet it carried no more lifeboats than smaller, older vessels. Why?" Ismay hesitated. "The decks needed to remain open. Too many lifeboats would clutter the view for first-class passengers." The silence that followed was suffocating. You could have heard a teardrop fall. Journalists stared at him, wide-eyed, pencils frozen in midair. Survivors in the room looked as though they had been struck. The idea that aesthetics had been prioritized over safety, that beauty had outweighed life, was almost too painful to process. Smith did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mr. Ismay," he said quietly, "many of those empty spaces where lifeboats could have been installed are now occupied by the dreams of the dead." Ismay's jaw clenched, his eyes lowered. For a moment, he said nothing. The public would dissect that moment for decades. Was Ismay ashamed, defensive, broken, or simply overwhelmed? Historians continue to debate his sincerity, but one truth was clear. He was no longer the confident tycoon who stood proudly beside the Titanic on its maiden departure. Now he was simply one man, drowning beneath the judgment of millions. As the days passed, the inquiry probed deeper into Ismay's decisions, not with emotional condemnation, but with forensic precision. Smith asked detailed questions about the ship's speed. Was the Titanic encouraged to maintain high speed despite traveling through iceberg-infested waters? Smith asked. No, Ismay insisted. There was no pressure. Not from me. Not from anyone. But survivors who had heard conversations on deck described a different story. One of subtle encouragement, not explicit orders. Rumors had long circulated that Ismay wanted the Titanic to arrive early in New York, as a display of the White Star Line's innovation and efficiency. Smith pressed him again. Did you express interest in the ship making a fast crossing? Ismay exhaled slowly. Senator, I may have expressed casual curiosity. Nothing more. Casual curiosity. That phrase would haunt him. It hung in the room like fog, present, but never quite solid. The inquiry could not legally convict him of forcing the ship to increase speed, but doubts spread like wildfire through the public. As one newspaper later printed, from Mr. Ismay's lips, truth appears only in fragments. But the most emotionally charged moment came when Smith addressed the question everyone wanted answered. The question that ignited the harshest criticism of his. Why had he survived when so many others had not? Smith leaned forward, allowing silence to stretch before asking, Mr. Why did you enter a lifeboat when hundreds remained aboard the ship? It was a question heavy enough to bend the floorboards. Ismay's right hand trembled. His breath caught. When he finally spoke, the room strained to catch every word. There were no women or children nearby when I entered, he said quietly. The boat was being lowered. I was told to step in. Had not, there would have been an empty seat. His voice cracked slightly. Smith studied him. His face was unreadable. Some survivors had supported Ismay's account. Others condemned him. Some claimed he was ordered in. Others claimed he pushed past. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between conflicting memories, but the public had already chosen their version. To them, he was the wealthy executive who had abandoned the ship he helped design. Fair or not, history rarely chooses its villains by merit, only by perception. The inquiry lasted hours that felt like days. By the end of it, Ismay slumped in his chair, his shoulders failing to hold their usual rigid posture. His handkerchief was damp with sweat. His voice had grown hoarse from explanations. That convinced some and infuriated others. But Smith was not done. His final statement that day was a reminder that the inquiry was not about spectacle. It was about ensuring that the tragedy would never be repeated. Mr. Ismay, he said steadily, the world placed trust in your company, trust in engineering, trust in the promise of safety. That trust has been shattered, and the lives lost demand that we rebuild it. Not with advertising, but with truth. Ismay nodded once, slowly. He looked smaller somehow, as though the chair were larger than when he'd first sat in it. He stood, bowed his head slightly, and walked out of the room. He would never fully recover from the weight of that walk. But the inquiry was far from over. The public's outrage continued to blaze, and the White Star Line felt the heat of it. Bookings plummeted. Shareholders panicked. The company's reputation, once gilded and impeccable, now felt tarnished beyond repair. The fate of the White Star Line was more than a corporate concern. It was a symbol of the age of luxury, speed, and human pride. And now that symbol was cracking beneath scrutiny. As one New York journalist wrote, the Titanic sank once, but the White Star Line is sinking still. And Senator Smith, consciously or not, had become the man pressing its hull deeper into the water. The story was not over, not for the inquiry. not for Ismay, and not for the company he represented. Because ahead waited the British investigation. Ahead waited the Californian controversy. Ahead waited reforms that would reshape maritime history. The waves had swallowed the Titanic, but the aftershocks were only beginning to rise. The British formal inquiry, Lord Mersey's official proceedings, the ornate chamber of the Wreck Commissioner's Court at the London Scottish Drill Hall had a peculiar kind of gravity the morning the British inquiry officially opened. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows painted long bars of pale gold across the wooden benches, but no warmth seemed to settle there. Even before the first witness was summoned, everyone present, naval officers, shipping officials, lawyers, spectators, squeezed into the back Roosevelt. The sharp, almost ceremonial weight of what was about to begin. The sinking of the RMS Titanic had stunned the world into a silence that was still vibrating across oceans. And now the British Empire, guardian of maritime power and prestige, was preparing to speak. At the center of the hall, elevated above all other desks, sat Lord Mersey, his posture upright, his expression carved with a kind of practiced neutrality. He was a man chosen precisely for this moment, controlled, unflinching, and trained to sift through chaos without losing sight of order. Yet even he felt the enormity of the task. The loss of more than 1,500 souls had not merely destroyed a ship. It had revealed cracks in the pride of an empire built on industry, steel, and dominion over the seas. His job, as the Wreck Commissioner, was deceptively simple. Determine how the Titanic sank, why, and who, if anyone, was responsible. But beneath that simplicity lay politics, public outrage, whispers of negligence, economic pressures, and the looming shadow of international embarrassment. The inquiry began with Lord Mersey reading a carefully worded statement that echoed through the chamber like a slow bell toll. He acknowledged the scale of the tragedy, the grief that had reached every corner of the empire, and the extraordinary public need for answers. The British government expected clarity. The Board of Trade expected vindication. The public expected truth. And the families of the dead, those whose lives had been ripped open, expected justice. It created a web of expectations so tangled that even a seasoned judge like Mersey had to tread cautiously. When the first witnesses were called, the tone of the inquiry shifted instantly. These were not detached, expert analysts or second-hand reports. They were living pieces of the nightmarish event itself. The survivors appeared fragile, worn down by sleepless nights and memories that clung to them like frost. Among them, seamen, firemen, stewards, wireless operators, and passengers of various classes took the stand, each recounting the same night, but from different corners of the ship. Their testimonies slowly stitched together something raw and living mosaic of the disaster. Much of the early focus rested on the Titanic's speed. Time and again, witnesses described the ship rushing through icy waters at nearly full throttle, despite multiple ice warnings received that very day. Lord Mersey listened, expression cool, while lawyers for the White Star Line scribbled notes with a kind of frantic restraint. They knew this issue. Speed was the beating heart of the public's anger. Why had a ship with so few lifeboats sailing through a known ice field not slowed down? In between testimonies, the hall buzzed with hushed speculation. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. Naval officers whispered among themselves, assessing each revelation with a blend of caution and professional rivalry. Some critics argued that the inquiry was too cozy with the world of shipping and government, that it would naturally lean toward protecting the reputation of the British maritime industry. Others believed Lord Mersey was incorruptible enough to cleave through all of that. But then came a witness no one could ignore. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia man, who had heroically saved the survivors. His calm, measured voice carried an authority that even Mersey seemed to respect. Rostron described the freezing night, the racing of his ship through ice in darkness, and the sight of Titanic's lifeboats scattered like lost ghosts across the Atlantic. His testimony wasn't merely technical. It was emotional, human, and when he finished, an unusual quiet settled across the chamber, as if the room itself needed a moment to process the weight of what he had relived. On the opposite side of the moral spectrum was J. Bruce Ismay, already battered by the American investigation and hounded relentlessly by the press. Here, in the British inquiry, he appeared pale, his confidence fraying at the edges. While he insisted he had acted purely in the interest of saving lives and helping others to safety, his presence alone triggered a tension thick enough to feel like physical pressure in the room. Spectators leaned forward. Journalists sharpened their pens. The White Star Line's lawyers prepared to shield him with every technicality they had. Lord Mersey did not spare him. The questions were direct, piercing. Why so few lifeboats? Why such speed? What role did he play after the collision? Had he influenced Captain Smith? Had he attempted to interfere with lifeboat procedures? Ismay answered each with varying degrees of certainty, at times defensive, at times shaken. And although he denied every accusation of wrongdoing, there was something about his demeanor, a haunted look in his eyes, perhaps that fueled public suspicion. The inquiry wasn't meant to be a theatrical judgment of character. Yet it was impossible to separate the man from the tragedy. Over the weeks, the inquiry grew into a daily drama for the entire British Empire. Newspapers printed front-page summaries of each day's testimony. Taverns buzzed with debate about whether the Board of Trade had grown complacent, whether the shipbuilders had cut corners, whether Captain Smith had been pressured to maintain speed for reputation, or whether the loss was simply an unfortunate accident of nature. The ordinary citizens of Britain, Ireland, Canada, and even distant colonies followed the inquiry, as if each new witness held a missing puzzle piece to a tragedy they still struggled to understand. Meanwhile, Lord Mersey remained unwavering. He dissected testimony with methodical patience, calling for ship plans, navigational charts, radiograms, logs of re-scrap of documentation that could help reconstruct the doomed voyage. Expert witnesses were summoned to explain the structural integrity of the ship, the behavior of steel in freezing temperatures, the mechanics of watertight compartments, and the limitations of wireless technology on the open sea. Listening to these technical details, the chamber often buzzed with murmurs of both awe and unease. The Titanic, once a monument to human innovation, was being carefully unraveled before their eyes. Its engineering brilliance was undeniable, yet flaws hidden under layers of prestige came into view. The testimony regarding the lifeboats was especially devastating. Sailors and passengers described the chaos, the confusion, and the disbelief that such a massive ship could actually sink. Some officers claimed they feared the lifeboats would collapse under weight, leading them to launch boats half empty. Others admitted to receiving contradictory orders. Several passengers recalled being told that the ship simply could not sink, right up until the deck angled sharply into the sea. Lord Mersey took all of it in. He kept his face still, his emotions tucked behind his judicial mask, but inside, he understood the stakes. His report would shape not only public memory, but also maritime law itself. He knew the world was watching. America had conducted its own investigation, but Britain Titanic's birthplace carried a different burden, accountability, wrapped in national pride. By the 6th week, the atmosphere in the hall had shifted from shock to a heavy, exhausted clarity. The threads of the story were aligning, though discomforting questions still hung in the air. Was the British Empire's maritime supremacy, built on assumptions of invincibility, had the pursuits of luxury and speed overshadowed safety? Had the Board of Trade grown too confident in outdated regulations? The inquiry could not change the past, but it could expose its weakest joints. One recurring theme haunted everyone: modernity itself. The Titanic had symbolized the peak of technological achievement, unsinkable, magnificent, a floating palace. Its loss felt like a betrayal by the very progress society worshipped. And in a way, Lord Mersey was not just investigating a shipwreck. He was investigating the limits of human confidence. Even at its most technical moments, the inquiry refused to lose its emotional undertow. Families of victims sat silently in the back rows, listening to every testimony with eyes hollowed by grief. Some clutched handkerchiefs, others held small photographs. Their presence was a living reminder that this was not merely about maritime laws, but about lives cut short, futures stolen, promises unfulfilled. The inquiry stretched on, testimony after testimony, until the chamber felt like a world unto itself, suspended between memory and judgment. And although the end was still weeks away, something significant had already begun to take shape. A reckoning, not just with the events of April 14th to 15th, 1912, but with the very idea of safety, authority, and the fragile line between human mastery and human error. And so, the inquiry carried on, with Lord Mersey sharpening his conclusions silently, piece by piece, as the world waited with bated breath for the report that would define Titanic's legacy forever. The scapegoat controversy. The case of the SS Californian. The SS Californian had been a whisper in the Atlantic night, an unnoticed observer of the catastrophe that had unfolded just a few miles away. Yet, in the weeks following the sinking of the Titanic, that whisper grew into a clamor, a storm of accusation, speculation, and outrage that reached across oceans and into the very chambers of power. The Californian was no longer just a ship. It had become a symbol, a focal point for frustration and grief, a vessel cast as both witness and scapegoat in a tragedy that had already claimed over 1,500 lives in London, New York, and beyond. The debate over the Californian's role quickly took on almost mythic proportions. The story was simple in outline, but maddening in its contradictions. On the night of April 14th, the Californian had stopped its engines when it approached a field of ice, and its wireless operator had gone off duty. According to some survivors, rockets had been seen in the distance, sporadic signals against the black of the Atlantic, but no reply came. The Titanic sank. The Californian did nothing, and history was suddenly filled with questions. Could more lives have been saved if the Californian had acted? Was its captain negligent, or had they acted with the limited information available? As the American and British inquiries progressed, the Californian came under intense scrutiny. In the U.S., it was a convenient target for moral outrage. The American press, still reeling from the horror of the loss of its citizens, portrayed the ship as an indifferent bystander, a silent, passive observer who had abandoned its duty at the very moment human lives depended upon action. Headlines screamed, "The silent witness, the ship that could have saved hundreds. Californian's captain faces wrath." Too many. The vessel itself seemed to embody the cold, cruel arbitrariness of fate. In London, the story was slightly different, but no less serious. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, faced the delicate task of balancing maritime honor with the hard facts of the night. Captain Stanley, Lord of the Californian, testified for hours, recounting the events with meticulous attention, yet under relentless questioning from counsel and historians of the day. The night had been unusually dark, with ice scattered across the northern Atlantic like jagged teeth in the black water. Lord insisted that his crew had seen rockets but believed them to be unrelated to any nearby vessel in distress. He emphasized that his wireless operator had gone to bed, and at that time, the technology of wireless communication was still new, inconsistent, and largely unregulated. Yet, the testimony of the Californian's crew clashed violently with survivor accounts from the Titanic. Some passengers swore they had seen the ship's lights from the deck of the Titanic, close enough that a call for help might have been answered. Others were more cautious, noting the haze of ice, the flickering visibility of rockets, and the chaos on board that had prevented organized signaling. The discrepancy was a puzzle, one that would dominate debate for decades. For the American public, the Californian became an almost mythical figure. Editorials attacked the captain personally, accusing him of cowardice, negligence, or worse, deliberate failure to intervene. Survivors who had made it to New York recounted the scene on the Titanic with a mixture of awe and horror, sometimes with tears and sometimes with righteous anger. They described the ship breaking apart, the cries echoing across the water, and the red rockets in the distance that went unanswered. In their minds, the Californian represented the hand of fate that had been offered the chance to prevent a catastrophe, only to turn away Dodd. In the British courts, the atmosphere was different but no less tense. The inquiry sought to contextualize the Californian's actions within the limits of maritime protocol, the inadequacies of technology, and the challenges of night navigation in icy waters. Experts on wireless communication testified about signal strength, frequency, and range. Maritime historians recounted regulations that had been in place for decades, rules that the Titanic itself had followed or ignored. Some argued that the Californian's inaction was understandable. Others called it an unforgivable failure. The inquiry, Lord Mersey emphasized, had to consider both the human and technological limitations present that night, as well as the moral responsibility inherent in command at sea. Captain Lord's own testimony was meticulous. He described the iceberg-strewn waters, the challenges of night navigation, and the difficulties in identifying signals from a distance. He spoke of the rocket scene, but asserted, with unwavering tone, that his crew had interpreted them as social signals or unrelated flashes. In the darkness, he said, one cannot make assumptions without evidence. Lives depend on judgment, not speculation. It was a statement that would be repeated in legal papers and historical texts for decades. But for those whose family members had perished, the argument of judgment offered little solace. Every story of missed opportunity, every detail of indecision, weighed on the conscience of the public. Letters poured into newspapers. Families demanded answers. Politicians, too, pressed for clarity, especially in America, where the loss of citizens was keenly felt. Congress and the Senate began to debate international maritime law reforms, in no small part spurred by the Californian controversy. It became clear that the discussion was no longer about a single ship or a single captain. It was about the protocols, technologies, and responsibilities of modern shipping. Meanwhile, the press transformed the Californian into a character in a story that had begun to border on legend. Illustrations showed the ship as a shadowy figure, outlined against stormy seas, indifferent to human cries. Editorials speculated on every possible scenario. What if the wireless operator had remained awake? What if the captain had acted immediately? What if the Californian had been closer than records indicated? Every question intensified the sense of moral urgency and fueled a narrative that demanded accountability. Yet historians who revisited the incident decades later noted that the Californian had not ignored human life. Out of malice, Captain Lord had followed contemporary protocols and the limitations of early 20th century wireless communication meant that distinguishing a distress signal from other flashes of light was far from simple. The ship had remained in position, ready to respond if called upon, but the chain of events had conspired to place it in a role it could not fully fulfill, and the perception of negligence, once cemented in public imagination, proved almost impossible to overturn. For the British inquiry, the Californian case underscored the complexities of the disaster. It revealed the interplay between human error, technological limitation, and the sheer unpredictability of the sea. Lord Mersey's final report, controversial in its conclusions, reflected these ambiguities. While he absolved the Californian and its captain of direct blame, he acknowledged the tragedy's nuances. The failure to respond in a timely manner, the missed signals, and the lingering questions about what might have been done differently. Yet public perception remained unmoved. In America, the story of the silent ship became a cautionary telemoral lesson in vigilance, duty, and the consequences of hesitation. The Californian was immortalized as the bystander, a reluctant witness to one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. Its name became synonymous with unfulfilled potential and human limitation in the face of tragedy. For the families of the lost, for the survivors, and for the global audience captivated by the events of April 14th to 15th, 1912, the debate over the Californian offered both clarity and frustration. Clarity, because it reinforced the limits of human control and the importance of protocols, training, and preparedness. Frustration, because it underscored how easily tragedy could be compounded by miscommunication and circumstance. Even today, the debate over the Californian remains a subject of fascination and study. Scholars examine the logs, survivors' testimonies, and technological limitations to understand how one ship might have altered the course of the disaster. Writers, filmmakers, and historians grapple with its symbolic weight, recognizing that the Californian represents more than a vessel. It embodies the tension between opportunity and action, observation and intervention, human error and fate. In the aftermath of the inquiry, the Californian controversy influenced policy changes that would ripple through international shipping. Maritime law evolved, wireless communication standards were revised, and the importance of lifeboat drills, safety protocols, and night monitoring became central to ship operations. Though the ship itself sailed on, its legacy remained intertwined with the Titanic, not as a savior, but as a stark reminder of how small decisions, or the absence of them, can alter the course of history. The story of the Californian was, in many ways, the story of the Titanic revisited, a reflection of human fallibility, the limits of technology, and the moral weight of command. For survivors, historians, and the world watching, it became clear that the tragedy was never about a single ship or a single captain. It was about the vast, interconnected machinery of decisions, errors, and circumstances, and the sobering reminder that sometimes, even with the best intentions, tragedy cannot be prevented. The legacy of reform, how maritime safety was in the weeks and months following the Titanic disaster, the world began to awaken to a stark reality. The oceans, once perceived as endless highways of commerce and luxury, were fraught with dangers that technology alone could not neutralize. The tragedy had not only claimed the lives of more than 1,500 souls, but it had also exposed the inadequacies of maritime law, regulations, and corporate responsibility. What had been a single night of horror now became the catalyst for an unprecedented reevaluation of safety at sea, legacy of reform that would ripple through the maritime world for decades to come. The first reforms came almost immediately, driven by both public outrage and political urgency. Newspapers, still echoing with accounts of the Titanic's sinking, demanded that lives lost not be forgotten in vain. Families of the victims, survivors, and members of the public rallied together to press governments for change. Across the Atlantic, policymakers convened, and in the United States, Senator William Alden Smith leveraged the findings of the American inquiry to propose legislation that would dramatically alter the way passenger ships operated. Across the ocean, Britain faced similar pressures, as Lord Mersey's report and the testimony of countless survivors left little room for delay. Safety at sea was no longer an optional consideration. It had become a moral and political imperative. Among the most immediate and visible reforms was the expansion and standardization of lifeboat requirements. The Titanic had carried lifeboats for only about half of its passengers and crew, a fact that had shocked the public and fueled widespread condemnation. After the inquiries, governments and maritime organizations around the world agreed that every passenger and crew member must have a designated place in a lifeboat. Ships were no longer permitted to carry a minimal number of boats dictated merely by outdated Board of Trade regulations. Instead, they were required to be prepared for full evacuation. In addition to increasing numbers, the design and accessibility of lifeboats were scrutinized. Companies were instructed to ensure that boats could be launched quickly and safely, even under conditions of panic and severe weather, and that crew members were adequately trained to operate them. The importance of training was further emphasized in the wake of the Titanic. Many officers and crew had been unprepared for a disaster of such magnitude. Some had followed procedures faithfully, yet still allowed chaos to reign. Others were uncertain about basic emergency protocols. Following the disaster, maritime authorities mandated regular lifeboat drills for passengers and crew, a practice that had previously been inconsistent or completely neglected. These drills were no longer symbolic. They were practical, rigorous exercises designed to instill familiarity with emergency procedures, identify weaknesses, and ensured that every person on board could act swiftly and effectively if the unthinkable happened. Wireless communication, too, underwent a revolution. Before the Titanic, the technology was still in its infancy, and protocols for its use were inconsistent. Wireless operators often worked under schedules that left ships isolated during critical hours. Messages were sometimes ignored, and communication between vessels was prone to error. The Titanic's distress calls, although received by nearby ships, had been misinterpreted or delayed, in part due to these limitations. After the disaster, regulations required continuous monitoring of wireless transmissions, 24 hours a day, ensuring that any distress call could be immediately acted upon. Standardized procedures were introduced, including clearly defined priorities for messages and obligatory training for operators. This reform alone would save countless lives in the years to come, transforming the way ships communicated across vast, treacherous oceans. International collaboration became another cornerstone of reform. The Titanic had been a British ship with many American passengers. Its sinking resonated worldwide. Governments recognized that maritime safety was not merely a national concern, but a global one. This led to the convening of conferences and the creation of agreements that standardized safety practices across borders. Ships sailing the North Atlantic and beyond would now be required to adhere to unified safety standards, including lifeboat capacity, wireless protocols, and navigation practices in iceberg-prone waters. This marked a significant shift in global maritime governance, one born from tragedy, but rooted in a collective understanding that the sea demanded universal vigilance. Among the most symbolic reforms was the establishment of the International Ice Patrol. The iceberg that the Titanic struck had been known to be in the area, yet no systematic observation or warning network had existed to monitor icebergs and alert ships. After the disaster, the International Ice Patrol was formed under the auspices of the U.S. Coast Guard, with the support of Britain and other maritime nations. Its mission was clear: to track icebergs, assess their and communicate warnings to ships navigating dangerous waters. For the first time, a structured system existed to anticipate one of the most unpredictable maritime hazards. The Ice Patrol represented the tangible manifestation of lessons learned and demonstrated how human ingenuity, combined with international cooperation, could prevent repetition of past mistakes. Maritime law itself was profoundly legal frameworks governing ship design, navigation, communication, and emergency response were expanded and clarified. Ships could no longer rely on vague or outdated regulations. They were now required to meet specific, enforceable standards. Inspections became more rigorous and frequent, with detailed scrutiny of life-saving equipment, crew readiness, and adherence to operational protocols. The emphasis shifted from corporate trust and reputation to objective safety measures and accountability. The Titanic had shown that prestige and wealth could not shield human life from preventable dangers, and legal reform was a direct response to this realization. The changes extended beyond the immediate technical and legal aspects. They influenced corporate culture, public expectations, and even the psychology of seafaring. Shipping companies, once focused predominantly on luxury, speed, and profitability, now had to prioritize safety as a core value. Crew training, passenger awareness, and procedural rigor became not optional add-ins, but fundamental responsibilities. Public confidence in ocean travel, though chicane was gradually restored by the knowledge that regulations had become stricter, inspections more detailed, and accountability more rigorous. In essence, the legacy of reform reshaped the social contract between passenger, crew, and company, ensuring that the trust placed in maritime operators was backed by enforceable safeguards. Yet, reform was not merely about policy or equipment. It also reshaped the collective understanding of risk and human vulnerability. The Titanic had been a symbol of modernity and invincibility, yet its loss demonstrated the fragility of human designs against the power of nature. Reform became a way of codifying that humility into action, practical, measurable, and enforceable. By embedding safety into law, operations, and international standards, societies acknowledged the limits of control while striving to prevent avoidable tragedy. It was a legacy born not only of technical innovation, but of hard-earned wisdom, a recognition that human error, hubris, and oversight could never again be allowed to claim such a vast toll unmitigated. These reforms also had broader ripple effects across maritime culture. Sailors, officers, and passengers began to internalize the lessons of the Titanic disaster. Lifeboat drills, emergency preparedness, and adherence to protocols became a central part of maritime life. Histories of the disaster circulated widely, and training manuals increasingly emphasized both technical skills and moral responsibility. The night of April 14th became a reference point, a cautionary tale that guided behavior on every ocean, in every harbor, and aboard every vessel navigating the North Atlantic and beyond. Its influence reached into literature, journalism, and education, ensuring that the lessons of that night were remembered, not only in law books, but in the hearts and minds of those who worked at sea. The Titanic's sinking also demonstrated the importance of oversight and transparency. Prior to the disaster, shipping companies had operated with considerable autonomy, and passengers often trusted reputation and branding more than verified safety practices. In the aftermath, inquiries revealed gaps in oversight, conflicts of interest, and inadequate enforcement of regulations. Reform sought to close these gaps, ensuring that government bodies had the authority, expertise, and responsibility to monitor compliance rigorously. It was a systemic shift that changed the relationship between industry and regulator, highlighting that accountability could not rest solely on corporate goodwill. And yet, the legacy of reform was not purely mechanical or legal. It was human. Survivors, families of the lost, and the public at large had demanded more than explanations. They had demanded that lessons be learned, that lives be honored by meaningful action. The reforms that followed were, in many ways, a tribute to those who perished. They ensured that the tragedy of the Titanic would resonate not only as a story of loss, but as a turning point in maritime historia moment, when human society collectively chose to confront its failings, to legislate vigilance, and to embed safety as a principle above all else. As the years passed, the Titanic became more than a ship lost to the sea. It became a benchmark. Vessels were redesigned with safety as a core principle. Regulations evolved continually, incorporating advances in technology, navigation, and communication. Wireless operators became indispensable. Lifeboats became standardized. Emergency drills became mandatory. And international cooperation ensured that hazards like icebergs would no longer go unmanned. The night of April 14th to 15th, 1912 had rewritten expectations, responsibilities, and practices across the maritime world. It was a grim lesson, but one whose impact was profound and enduring. The legacy of reform, however, also carried a subtle moral dimension. It acknowledged that tragedy often arises not from malice, but from oversight, arrogance, or lack of preparedness. The Titanic had been a marvel of engineering, but it had also been a mirror reflecting human imperfection. The new rules, standards, and practices were society's attempt to bridge that gap in effort to translate grief into action, horror into caution, and loss into lasting lessons. In this way, the Titanic's story transcended its immediate horror, shaping generations of seafaring practice and influencing not only ships and regulations, but the very culture of maritime responsibility. And so, the legacy of reform unfolded across oceans, ports, and harbors worldwide. It was written into law, technology, corporate practice, and human behavior. The reforms ensured that the Titanic's tragedy would remain a cautionary tale, but one whose lessons were applied rigorously to prevent recurrence. The night of April 14th had ended in unimaginable loss, but in its aftermath, a new era of maritime safety had begun. Silent but powerful tribute to those who had perished and a safeguard for generations to come. The birth of the Ice Patrol, preventing the next tragedy. The sinking of the Titanic had left a scar not only on the hearts of those who lost loved ones, but also on the maritime world itself. As the public demanded action, governments realized that tragedy was not merely the result of human error or ship disaster, was also a consequence of unpredictable natural hazards. Among the most immediate and pressing dangers was the presence of icebergs in the North Atlantic. Ships crossing the ocean relied on experience, luck, and sparse reports to avoid collisions, a system that had proven fatally inadequate. In the wake of the Titanic disaster, a bold solution began to take shape: the creation of the International Ice Patrol. The Ice Patrol was more than a policy or a set of regulations. It was an institution built to save lives by systematically monitoring ice in the transatlantic shipping lanes. The United States Coast Guard, with international support, assumed responsibility for patrolling the waters where the Titanic had met its fate. The logic was simple, yet revolutionary. Instead of leaving ships to chance or relying on outdated charts, an organized service would track icebergs and relay warnings to vessels in real time. For the first time, human society sought to impose structure on the wild and unpredictable forces of the ocean, transforming what had been a lethal unknown into a manageable risk. Captain Frederick C. Murphy, one of the earliest commanders of the Ice Patrol, described the enormity of the task in interviews decades later. "We were trying to find the invisible in a moving, dangerous sea," he explained. "To see what was barely visible and warn those who could not see it themselves." Icebergs are treacherous not only because of their size, but because the majority of their mass remains submerged, invisible beneath the waterline. Even a single misjudgment could result in catastrophe, as the Titanic had shown. Patrol vessels, using the best tools and observations available at the time, began systematically mapping ice movements, measuring drift speeds, and sending coded warnings via wireless telegraphy to ships in the shipping lanes. The creation of the Ice Patrol also reflected a profound shift in international collaboration. Though the Titanic had been a British ship with many American passengers, its sinking resonated globally. No nation could claim exclusive authority over the Atlantic. A disaster anywhere in the shipping lanes could have consequences everywhere. The Ice Patrol was a tangible manifestation of this understanding. American resources and naval discipline combined with European expertise, creating a multinational effort to anticipate danger rather than merely respond to it. It was a model of cooperation born of tragedy, a silent testament to lessons learned through the loss of thousands. Early operations were both difficult and dangerous. Ships patrolling the frigid waters had to contend with ice, storms, and freezing temperatures. Crews spent long hours on deck, scanning the horizon with binoculars, recording every floating mass of ice, and estimating its trajectory. Observations were sent via wireless messages to shore stations, which then relayed warnings to commercial vessels. The task required precision, patience, and courage. Each successful warning delivered by the patrol represented not just data, but potentially hundreds of lives saved, and each failure carried the moral weight of the Titanic's shadow. The Ice Patrol also had a profound psychological impact on the maritime community. Captains and crews who had once relied largely on experience and personal judgment now had access to scientifically gathered information about ice hazards. Ships could alter course in response to warnings, reducing the risk of collision and giving officers confidence that they were not alone against the perils of the sea. It was a subtle but powerful change. Humanity was asserting control over what had previously been considered uncontrollable, demonstrating a commitment to proactive, evidence-based safety. In addition to immediate operational benefits, the Ice Patrol influenced broader maritime policy. It inspired similar initiatives for weather observation, navigation aids, and safety reporting. Maritime authorities increasingly recognized that oversight, monitoring, and information sharing were essential components of safe ocean travel. The Titanic's disaster had revealed not only flaws in ship design and emergency preparedness, but also vulnerabilities in the broader system of oceanic navigation. The Ice Patrol became a model of preventive strategy, showing that infrastructure, coordination, and vigilance could save lives before tragedy struck. The patrol's formation was also a symbolic act of accountability. The Titanic had highlighted human limitations and the consequences of oversight, both in the corporate realm and in navigation. By creating an institution dedicated to monitoring and warning against ice, governments were acknowledging that prevention was a responsibility shared by society as a whole. It was not sufficient to build stronger ships or improve lifeboats. Society needed to anticipate danger, respond to early warning signs, and act collectively to protect lives. The Ice Patrol represented the moral and practical commitment to ensure that history did not repeat itself. Over time, technology enhanced the patrol's effectiveness, initially relying on ships, observations, binoculars, and wireless signals. The Ice Patrol later incorporated aerial reconnaissance, sonar, and satellite imaging. Each innovation allowed for earlier detection, more accurate tracking, and faster communication. Modern vessels could navigate the North Atlantic with far greater safety, guided by decades of accumulated knowledge and continuous observation. The Titanic, though gone, had fundamentally altered the framework of maritime safety, and the Ice Patrol was one of its most enduring legacies. Yet the story of the Ice Patrol was not merely technical. It carried with it the memory of lives lost, serving as a silent reminder of the night when the Titanic struck an iceberg and thousands perished. For the sailors and officers serving on patrol ships, every iceberg identified, every warning issued, was a tribute to the past and a promise for the future. The mission transformed abstract lessons into tangible action, demonstrating that human ingenuity, discipline, and foresight could mitigate the deadliest consequences of nature's unpredictability. The Ice Patrol also reshaped the culture of responsibility at sea. Shipping companies now had to integrate its warnings into operational planning, ensuring that vessels would alter course when danger was detected. Captains learned to value intelligence and coordination over risk-taking, and crews were trained to respect the information provided by the patrol. It was a systemic change, reinforcing the idea that the ocean, though vast and powerful, could be navigated safely through collective vigilance, foresight, and adherence to CNC-informed protocols. By establishing the Ice Patrol, authorities transformed tragedy into proactive protection. The North Atlantic, once a perilous gauntlet of ice, became safer not by chance, but through observation, data, and action. The Titanic's legacy was etched not only in mourning and memorials, but in this tangible, preventative institution. It was an enduring example of how human society could learn from catastrophe, translate grief into policy, and honor lives lost by saving countless others in the years to come. And yet, even with the patrol in operation, the memory of April 14th to 15th, 1912, lingered. Every iceberg sighted carried echoes of the Titanic's fate, reminding sailors and the public alike that vigilance was eternal. The Ice Patrol was not merely a mechanism for navigation. It was a moral and historical promise that the night's horrors would be remembered, and that humanity would act to ensure that tragedy, once endured, would not be repeated. New wireless mandates. The rule of 24/7 radio monitoring. The Titanic disaster had revealed a stark and chilling truth. Technology, when used inconsistently or neglected, could no longer be trusted to protect lives at sea. Among the clearest failures of that night was wireless communication. Distress signals sent by the Titanic had reached nearby ships, yet responses were delayed, confused, or non-existent. Operators on other vessels were off duty, messages were mismanaged, and critical warnings went unheard. The consequences were catastrophic. In the wake of the disaster, maritime authorities and governments worldwide recognized that wireless technology, revolutionary though it was, required strict, enforceable protocols to fulfill its life-saving potential. Thus began the era of the 24/7 wireless monitoring mandate. Before the Titanic, wireless telegraphy, commonly referred to as Marconi radio, was still considered optional by many shipping companies. Operators were often hired for convenience, tasked with sending passenger messages rather than maintaining a continuous watch for emergencies. Operators would work shifts that left gaps in coverage, sometimes taking breaks without clear instructions on who would monitor distress frequencies in their absence. Ships traversed thousands of miles of open ocean with only partial vigilance, relying on luck, proximity, and the hope that no catastrophe would strike during these blind periods. The Titanic's tragedy exposed the deadly consequences of such laxity. The first step in reform came from rigorous inquiry findings. Both the American and British investigations made it clear that wireless operator schedules, responsibilities, and oversight were insufficient. In New York, American legislators, led by Senator William Alden Smith, introduced measures requiring vessels to maintain continuous radio monitoring at all times. The mandate dictated that ships must have qualified operators on duty 24 hours a day, trained to recognize distress signals, relay messages promptly, and communicate with other vessels and shore stations without delay. It was a paradigm shift in maritime responsibility. The wireless room, once secondary to luxury and cargo operations, became a central hub of life-saving authority. For the maritime industry, compliance with this mandate demanded major operational adjustments. Shipping companies had to hire more trained operators, establish shift rotations, and ensure that equipment was properly maintained at all times. Ships crossing the Atlantic now carried operators whose sole responsibility was monitoring emergency channels continuously. Any lapse could result not only in corporate liability, but in loss of life. The Titanic had demonstrated the price of neglect, and the new rules ensured that negligence would no longer be tolerated. Alongside operational reforms, technological improvements were encouraged. Wireless transmitters and receivers were upgraded to provide longer range, clearer signals, and redundancy in case of equipment failure. Shore stations along the coastlines of both North America and Europe were equipped to monitor distress frequencies, relay messages to nearby vessels, and coordinate rescue efforts. The infrastructure that grew from these mandates transformed the very nature of maritime safety. Ships no longer sailed into the Atlantic blind to emergencies. Instead, a continuous, interconnected network of communication ensured that cries for help could never go unheard. The social and psychological impact of these changes was profound. Passengers, once fearful that a disaster might go unnoticed, now had the assurance that every ship carried trained personnel watching for distress. Crews developed a culture of vigilance, understanding that their attention could be the difference between life and death. Operators themselves gained new professional authority and responsibility, their role elevated from convenience to critical safeguard. Wireless rooms became nerve centers, coordinating responses, tracking other ships, and ensuring that any emergency could be addressed immediately. Case studies following implementation illustrated the effectiveness of the reforms. Ships encountering storms, collisions, or mechanical failures could call for help immediately, confident that operators on surrounding vessels and shore stations would respond. The combination of continuous monitoring, standardized protocols, and trained personnel significantly increased survival rates in maritime accidents. The Titanic, though lost to history, had catalyzed a revolution in operational vigilance, where, once the sea had been a vast, anonymous expanse, it now carried an invisible safety network capable of immediate response. The reforms also emphasized accountability. Operators were required to follow strict reporting procedures, maintaining logs of messages sent and received, and subject to inspection by maritime authorities. Failure to respond appropriately was treated as negligence, with consequences both legal and professional. Shipping companies, recognizing the reputational and financial risks, invested in staff training, equipment reliability, and operational oversight. Wireless communication evolved from an optional convenience into a critical component of every voyage, integrated with lifeboat procedures, emergency drills, and international coordination efforts. International maritime law also codified the new wireless requirements. Conferences and agreements, standardized distress frequencies, signal codes, and operational responsibilities. Distress calls, such as CQD and later SOS, became globally recognized, ensuring that ships from different nations could communicate clearly in emergencies. Operators trained in these protocols could respond effectively, regardless of vessel, nationality, language, or location. The Titanic had highlighted the dangers of ambiguity. The wireless reforms eliminated it. Perhaps most importantly, the rule of 24/7 radio monitoring reflected a broader philosophy of prevention rather than reaction. Before, maritime safety often relied on luck, human judgment, or ad hoc intervention. After the Titanic, it became clear that structured, continuous observation was essential. The wireless room became a symbol of foresight, vigilance, and the moral responsibility to act. Operators were no longer passive technicians. They were guardians of life, tasked with bridging the gap between disaster and rescue. Culturally, the reforms reinforced the sense of human accountability in the face of nature's unpredictability. Ships might still face icebergs, storms, or mechanical failures, but failure to respond could no longer be excused by inattention or understaffing. The 24/7 mandate represented society's assertion that, even in the vastness of the ocean, human diligence could prevent needless death. It was a recognition that progress, technology, and regulation were inseparable from responsibility, a principle that would guide maritime operations for generations. The legacy of the wireless mandates was not limited to survival rates. They influenced training academies, corporate governance, and international cooperation. Operators became integral members of ship crews. Emergency procedures were continuously updated, and global shipping standards evolved in ways that directly reflected lessons learned from the Titanic. The reforms marked a turning point in maritime history, demonstrating that tragedy, though devastating, could be transformed into systemic improvements capable of saving lives. Even decades later, the culture established by the 24/7 wireless monitoring mandate endured. Ships traversing remote oceans carried multiple operators, redundant communication systems, and protocols ensuring that distress calls were never ignored. Operators were trained rigorously. Equipment was maintained meticulously, and the network of communication spanned oceans and nations. The Titanic's disaster, though rooted in human error and hubris, had inspired a technological and procedural response that fundamentally changed how maritime safety was conceived. Thus, the wireless reforms of the post-Titanic era represented more than technical adjustments. They symbolized humanity's commitment to responsibility, vigilance, and foresight. The tragedy had revealed the deadly consequences of inattention. The reforms ensured that no operator, no crew, and no vessel could ignore a call for help. They institutionalized a culture of care, attention, and readiness, safeguarding countless lives in the decades to come. Psychological fallout, survivors, guilt, and the American public. The Titanic's sinking left scars far deeper than the physical wreckage at the bottom of the Atlantic. While headlines recounted the loss of life, the dramatic rescues, and the heroic efforts of ships like the RMS Carpathia, the psychological impact on survivors, families, and the broader public unfolded in more subtle, yet equally profound ways. For many, the horror did not end when they stepped ashore in New York or London. It lingered, invisible but persistent, shaping memories, relationships, and even the culture of mourning itself. Survivors often returned home physically exhausted, but emotionally traumatized. The icy waters, the chaotic lifeboat evacuations, the screams of those left behind, all imprinted on their memories in ways that would endure for decades. Many reported vivid flashbacks, nightmares, and an unshakable sense of guilt. This survivor guilt manifested in multiple ways. Some blamed themselves for leaving others behind. Some struggled with the arbitrary nature of survival, while others wrestled with feelings of shame at having been spared while loved ones perished. Psychologists later described this as a complex interplay of grief, trauma, and moral responsibility, and it became a defining feature of the Titanic's human legacy. Families of the lost also faced profound psychological challenges. News of the disaster traveled quickly across the Atlantic, and American households grappled with grief even before the full scale of the tragedy became clear. Letters from relatives, newspaper articles, and survivor testimonies often intensified anxiety and despair. Parents, children, spouses, and siblings confronted a reality in which entire lives could be extinguished in a single night, a reality that seemed both arbitrary and cruel. Public memorials, charity efforts, and newspapers became venues for collective mourning, but they could not fully assuage the personal anguish felt in homes across the country. The broader American public also experienced psychological fallout. On a societal level, the Titanic was not just a British ship. It carried hundreds of American passengers, many of them prominent figures or wealthy. Newspapers capitalized on this, broadcasting survivor interviews, dramatic rescue accounts, and stories that captivated readers. The repeated retelling of terror and loss reinforced collective empathy, but it also amplified public anxiety about safety, technology, and trust in institutions. Ships, once considered symbols of human achievement, were suddenly perceived as fragile vessels of risk. Public confidence in maritime travel wavered, prompting widespread debate about regulation, corporate responsibility, and human oversight. In the immediate aftermath, journalists chronicled stories that were both intimate and harrowing. Survivors spoke of the moments when lifeboats were launched, the freezing waters beneath them, and the cries that echoed across the night. They recalled the moral dilemmas faced during evacuation, who to save first, whom to leave behind, and the agonizing choices of prioritizing survival. These narratives were emotionally raw, emphasizing the human fragility at the heart of the Titanic disaster. Readers empathized, mourned, and, in some cases, internalized the fear themselves, sparking conversations about mortality, responsibility, and human vulnerability on a scale rarely seen in peacetime disasters. For survivors, coping mechanisms varied widely. Some threw themselves into philanthropy, organizing charitable efforts to assist victims' families or improve maritime safety, turning trauma into purpose. Others retreated into silence, unwilling to revisit the events of the night or face public attention. Many relied on community support, religious faith, or professional therapy when it was available. The act of sharing stories through interviews, memoirs, or lectures became both therapeutic and socially significant, helping to process grief while also educating the public about the perils of hubris and negligence. Children who lost parents or witnessed family members' deaths faced particular challenges. The sudden, violent absence of parental figures or siblings altered the trajectory of their development. Survivors often recounted the lasting impression of fear and confusion, feelings of helplessness at the scale of loss, and the emotional shock of hearing stories about others perishing while they survived. The Titanic tragedy became, in these cases, a defining childhood trauma, shaping personality, resilience, and moral outlook for years to come. The social elite, who comprised a significant portion of the Titanic's first-class passengers, experienced unique pressures. Their survival or loss carried social and media scrutiny, and they were often portrayed as either heroic or cowardly, depending on public perception. The American press, eager for sensational stories, sometimes framed survivors as symbols of moral virtue or failure. This magnified the emotional strain, as individuals contended not only with personal grief, but with the expectations and judgments of a broader audience. Reputation, honor, and the cultural narrative of survival all became intertwined with psychological recovery. Meanwhile, the collective American psyche was profoundly affected by the scale and drama of the disaster. The Titanic became a lens through which Americans examined modernity, technology, and human ambition. It forced the public to confront the limits of engineering, the vulnerabilities of innovation, and the consequences of societal arrogance. Newspapers, lectures, and public discourse repeatedly revisited the disaster, keeping anxiety alive, but also embedding a sense of vigilance. It was a societal trauma, as much as a personal one that influenced attitudes toward transportation, safety, regulation, and trust in institutions for years to come. Survivors' guilt, in particular, was amplified by public narratives. Accounts often highlighted the actions of lifeboat occupants, sometimes portraying them as heroes, other times questioning their choices. Individuals who had acted courageously still felt remorse for those who could not be saved. Psychologists and historians note that this form of moral distress, where one survives while others perish under circumstances beyond personal control, can persist for decades, affecting relationships, career choices, and even physical health. In the case of Titanic survivors, many lived with this invisible burden, a constant reminder of the night's chaos and unpredictability. For families and communities, the psychological impact intertwined with societal expectations of mourning and remembrance. Memorials, commemorations, and charitable activities allowed communities to process grief collectively, yet they could never replace what was lost. The ongoing media coverage ensured that the tragedy remained in the public consciousness, a continuous reminder of vulnerability and loss. In this sense, the Titanic disaster transcended its immediate victims. shaping cultural understanding of trauma, empathy, and moral responsibility on a national scale. Importantly, the American psychological response also influenced policy and safety culture. Public outrage over the loss of life and the stories of survivors suffering accelerated reforms in maritime law, communication protocols, and emergency preparedness. Governments and shipping companies were pressured to act not only out of moral duty, but also to restore public confidence. In this way, the psychological fallout had tangible consequences. Grief, guilt, and collective anxiety became catalysts for systemic change, ensuring that the lessons of the Titanic would be integrated into future practices and regulations. Decades later, historians and psychologists would reflect on the disaster's enduring impact. The trauma endured by survivors and the public alike was studied as a case of large-scale psychological shock, highlighting the intersection of personal loss, societal expectation, and media influence. The Titanic's story became a reference point in understanding survivor psychology, public mourning, and the cultural processing of mass disasters. The human response is fear, guilt, grief. Resilience provided insight into how societies confront catastrophe, remember the dead, and attempt to prevent future tragedies. Ultimately, the psychological fallout of the Titanic was not a singular event, but an ongoing process. Survivors carried memories of terror, loss, and moral questioning. Families of the dead confronted unending grief. The American public absorbed both fear and fascination, shaping attitudes toward technology, transportation, and safety through memoirs, interviews, media coverage, and personal reflection. The emotional impact of that night was recorded, studied, and remembered, ensuring that the Titanic's lessons extended far beyond maritime reforms. It was a reminder that human lives and the minds that inhabit them were as much at risk as any ship at sea. Decades of silence. The long and costly search for the wreck. 4 decades after the Titanic sank beneath the cold Atlantic waters on that fateful night of April 14th, 1912, the world was left with a haunting silence, while newspapers, books, and personal accounts chronicled the human tragedy. The ship itself remained unseen, lying undisturbed more than 2 miles below the ocean's surface. The wreck was a mystery, a ghostly reminder of hubris and loss, and the oceans, vast and unforgiving, seemed to have claimed it entirely. The Titanic had become an invisible monument, a symbol of both human ambition and the limits of exploration. In the years following the disaster, numerous attempts were made to locate the ship, driven by curiosity, historical interest, and, in some cases, commercial motive. Early expeditions were hampered by the technological limitations of the ERA. Sonar and underwater photography were in their infancy. Deep-sea navigation was imprecise, and the vastness of the North Atlantic made the task daunting. Ships scoured wide swaths of ocean, with little hope of precise success. Many expeditions returned empty-handed, contributing to the growing sense that the Titanic might never be found. Despite the failures, interest in the Titanic's resting place remained intense. Stories of heroism, scandal, and tragedy ensured that the ship was never forgotten. Historians, amateur explorers, and journalists alike debated its final position, reconstructing trajectories based on survivor accounts, iceberg reports, and early navigational charts. Each failed expedition added to the mystique of the Titanic. The ocean had swallowed it completely, leaving only fragments of memory, speculation, and longing. By the mid-20th century, technological progress had improved the possibilities of locating the wreck. Echo-sounding early submersibles and remotely operated vehicles began to allow limited exploration of the deep sea. Yet the Titanic's final resting place remained elusive. Several expeditions claimed to be near the wreck, only to find nothing but deep trenches, scattered debris, or misidentified formations. These false alarms added to the sense of frustration and fascination surrounding the ship, highlighting the sheer difficulty of deep-sea exploration even as technology slowly advanced. The prolonged silence surrounding the wreck also had a profound psychological impact on the public and on Titanic enthusiasts. Generations grew up knowing of the disaster, studying its causes, and empathizing with its survivors. But the ship itself remained a phantom. There was something almost mythical about the ocean hiding the Titanic, a reminder of nature's dominance over human engineering. It became a story not just of tragedy, but of mystery, blending history with legend. The inability to locate the wreck lent an eerie permanence to the disaster, as though the ship's secrets would remain sealed indefinitely. The search for the Titanic was expensive, technically demanding, and fraught with risk. Private companies, scientific teams, and even governments invested significant resources into deep-sea expeditions, each hoping to answer questions about the ship's final moments. Equipment had to withstand immense pressures, extreme cold, and unpredictable currents. Navigational accuracy was critical, as even a minor miscalculation could result in missing the wreck entirely. In many cases, expeditions ended in disappointment, equipment loss, or significant financial strain. Yet the allure of the Titanic's mystery proved irresistible, driving persistence through decades of failure. Interest in the wreck was also fueled by the desire for closure, both historical and personal. Survivors and relatives of victims wanted answers. How exactly had the ship broken apart? What condition were the decks and cabins in? Were personal belongings preserved? These questions were not merely academic, they were deeply human, tied to grief, memory, and the search for understanding. The silence of the deep sea left these questions unanswered, prolonging the psychological aftermath of the disaster. By the 1970s and early 1980s, advancements in technology finally brought a sense of possibility. Side scan, sonar, submersible cameras, and improved deep-sea navigation allowed explorers to search wider areas with greater accuracy. Yet, even with these advancements, the Titanic remained a formidable challenge. Ocean currents, shifted debris, and the vast underwater terrain complicated efforts to pinpoint the wreck's exact location. Each expedition required meticulous planning, patience, and substantial funding, underscoring the scale of human ambition required to overcome the ocean's depths. The decades-long silence surrounding the Titanic also influenced public perception and memory. Books, documentaries, and films built narratives around both the tragedy and the mystery of the lost ship. Children grew up reading about the disaster, imagining the ship resting silently beneath the waves. The combination of history, heroism, scandal, and mystery created a cultural fascination that transcended generations. Even without the wreck's discovery, the Titanic had already entered the collective imagination. Becoming more than a ship, it was a symbol of human ambition, hubris, and the inexorable power of nature. The search itself became a story of determination and ingenuity. Researchers and explorers, aware of the immense challenges, combined scientific rigor with adventurous spirit. They learned from previous failures, improved methodologies, and expanded international collaboration. Slowly, the cumulative knowledge of oceanography, sonar mapping, and historical reconstruction brought the Titanic closer to being found. Yet, even as technology advanced, the deep ocean remained a realm of mystery and danger, reminding humanity of the limits that persisted despite progress. In this long silence, the Titanic's story continued to captivate the imagination of millions. It was a narrative not just of the past, but of the human desire to confront the unknown, to reconcile loss, and to reclaim history from nature's depths. Each failed expedition, each false sighting, and each technical setback added to the legend, making the eventual discovery all the more anticipated and meaningful. The silence of the wreck was, paradoxically, a kind of resonanza, constant echo of the tragedy that continued to shape culture, memory, and the collective imagination. The Titanic, lying hidden beneath miles of ocean, became a touchstone for the human struggle against nature, technological limits, and the unknowable, while survivors, families, and historians waited decades for answers. The silence served as a haunting reminder that some questions could not be answered immediately, no matter the sophistication of tools or the determination of those who sought the truth. The ocean's depths held the ship like a secret, preserving it until humanity was ready both technologically and morally to confront it. Thus, the long, costly search for the Titanic was more than a quest for a ship. It was a journey through human grief, determination, and curiosity. It illustrated the enduring intersection of history, memory, and technology. Where human ingenuity strives to reclaim what the sea has hidden, the decades of silence were themselves a part of the Titanic's story, shaping both the myth and the reality of a ship whose final resting place lay just beyond reach for 73 years. The 1985 discovery, Robert Ballard, and the new chapter in history. For more than 7 decades, the Titanic rested in silent darkness at the bottom of the North Atlantic. Though survivors' accounts, historical records, and speculative maps kept the ship's story alive, its physical presence remained shrouded in mystery. The immense depth, treacherous currents, and vastness of the ocean floor had rendered decades of exploratory efforts fruitless. Yet human curiosity and determination would not be deterred. In 1985, a breakthrough expedition led by oceanographer Robert Ballard would finally lift the veil, revealing a world frozen in time and beginning a new chapter in both maritime history and collective imagination. Ballard's expedition was the culmination of years of technological innovation and methodological refinement. Unlike earlier searches, which often relied on chance sightings and surface-based approximations, Ballard employed advanced deep-sea technology, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and sophisticated sonar mapping allowed his team to scan the ocean floor with unprecedented precision. The mission was carefully planned, integrating historical accounts of the Titanic's final trajectory with scientific models of ocean currents, sediment, displacement, and underwater topography. Each calculation and adjustment brought the team closer to a ship that had been lost for 73 years, a vessel that had captured the world's imagination long before it was found. The discovery itself was both awe-inspiring and solemn, as the first images of the Titanic's bow emerged on monitors. The team was confronted with the scale and majesty of the ship, alongside the haunting reminders of its destruction. The bow, though partially collapsed, remained recognizable, pointing upward from the seabed as if still advancing across the ocean. Debris fields scattered across the surrounding expanse, bore witness to the violent forces of nature. Yet the ship's structure also spoke to the craftsmanship and ambition of early 20th century engineering. The juxtaposition of preservation and decay evoked a profound sense of respect and melancholy among those witnessing the images. The expedition revealed new details about the Titanic's final moments. Observations of the wreck confirmed that the ship had broken into two primary sections, bow and stern, contradicting some earlier theories and validating others. Items from the passenger decks, from personal belongings to lifeboat fragments, were strewn across the ocean floor, providing insight into the chaos that ensued during evacuation. These tangible remnants of human life offered both historians and the public a deeply personal connection to the tragedy. While photographs and documents had preserved memories, the wreck itself became a three-dimensional archive of history, frozen in an alien and inaccessible world. Ballard's discovery was also a testament to the interplay between human perseverance and technological innovation. The Titanic's location had eluded researchers for decades, not for lack of effort, but because previous tools were insufficient. By combining historical scholarship with cutting-edge marine science, Ballard demonstrated how multidisciplinary approaches could conquer challenges once deemed impossible. The expedition transformed not only the understanding of the Titanic itself, but also the broader field of deep-sea exploration, establishing new standards for remote observation, preservation, and analysis of submerged sites. The cultural impact of the discovery was immediate and profound. For the first time, the public could see the Titanic not as an abstract story of loss and heroism, but as a tangible artifact lying quietly beneath the waves. Media outlets broadcast images of the wreck. Museums curated exhibitions based on recovered items, and scholars re-evaluated historical narratives in light of the new evidence. The discovery bridged the gap between history and reality, allowing people to connect with the tragedy on a visual, emotional, and intellectual level. It was a moment in which history became physically present, a silent witness to the human drama that had unfolded more than 7 decades earlier. The expedition also raised ethical and philosophical questions about human interaction with the deep sea. While some saw the Titanic as a sacred site, a grave for over 1,500 individuals, others viewed its discovery as an opportunity to study, preserve, and share lessons about engineering, safety, and human ambition. Ballard himself emphasized the need for respect and preservation, advocating for non-intrusive observation that honored the site's historical and human significance. The wreck was not merely an object of curiosity, it was a repository of memory, a solemn reminder of human fallibility, and a symbol of the consequences of hubris. In addition, the discovery influenced maritime scholarship profoundly. Structural analysis of the ship, now possible with precise photographic and sonar data, allowed historians and engineers to understand the failures in design and construction that contributed to the Titanic's rapid sinking. The positioning of bulkheads, the spread of fire-resistant materials, and the limitations of lifeboat deployment were all re-evaluated. Each insight informed not only historical knowledge, but contemporary maritime practices, reinforcing the enduring lesson that tragedy can, when carefully studied, yield guidance for the future. The discovery also reignited interest in survivors' narratives. Interviews, memoirs, and letters were revisited, this time with the ability to cross-reference physical evidence. Items recovered from the wreck matched stories of personal belongings, lifeboat launches, and crew efforts, validating eyewitness accounts and offering a fuller, more nuanced picture of the disaster. This convergence of material and testimonial evidence created a multidimensional understanding of the Titanic, blending history, archaeology, and human experience in a way never before possible. Furthermore, Ballard's discovery transformed the Titanic into a global cultural touchstone for a new generation. Books, documentaries, and later films drew on the visual evidence of the wreck to craft narratives that combined heroism, hubris, romance, and tragedy. The Titanic ceased to be merely an event in the past. It became a living story, perpetually revisited and reinterpreted. Its physical presence beneath the ocean lent authenticity and emotional weight to allowing history to resonate more powerfully across continents and generations. Yet beyond the excitement of discovery lay a profound solemnity. Each image of the ship, each fragment of deck or cabin, was a reminder of lives lost and ambitions unrealized. Ballard's expedition, while a triumph of science and perseverance, was also a moment of reflection, a reminder that human progress, no matter how advanced, cannot fully shield against nature's indifference. The Titanic, preserved in darkness, continued to speak silently of mortality, responsibility, and the consequences of hubris. In many ways, the 1985 discovery was both an ending and a beginning. It concluded decades of speculation and searching, resolving one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. At the same time, it opened new avenues of study, interpretation, and public engagement. The wreck became a classroom for marine archaeology, a catalyst for cultural reflection, and a bridge connecting history to the present. Humanity, long separated from the Titanic by miles of water and decades of time, could finally confront the ship in all its tragic majesty. The legacy of Ballard's discovery extended beyond the Titanic itself. It inspired renewed interest in maritime archaeology, deep-sea exploration, and preservation of submerged cultural heritage. Teams around the world adopted similar methodologies for locating and studying other shipwrecks, ensuring that the lessons learned from the Titanic's resting place would inform not only historical understanding, but the stewardship of oceans and heritage sites. In this way, the discovery was transformative, not just for the Titanic, but for the broader field of human inquiry and exploration. Ultimately, the 1985 discovery was a convergence of technology, persistence, and human curiosity. It reaffirmed the Titanic's place in history, not only as a cautionary tale of human hubris, but also as a catalyst for learning, reflection, and cultural memory. Through Ballard's efforts, the silent decades beneath the Atlantic were broken, and a new chapter began, one in which the Titanic could be studied, understood, and remembered in ways unimaginable to the survivors and witnesses of 1912. The enduring myth, why the Titanic, still captures the American imagination. More than a century after it sank beneath the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic, the Titanic continues to occupy a unique place in the American imagination. It is not merely a story of disaster. It is a narrative of human ambition, technological triumph, societal hierarchy, and the haunting unpredictability of nature. Its myth endures because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously as a historical event, a cautionary tale, a cultural touchstone, and an emotional experience that transcends generations. Even today, Americans remain captivated by the Titanic, drawn to its stories of heroism, tragedy, scandal, and mystery. The myth begins with scale. At the time of its construction, the Titanic was the largest, most luxurious, and most technologically advanced ship ever built. Its size and opulence were not just practical achievements, they were statements of human ingenuity and ambition. Americans, accustomed to celebrating grand achievements and symbols of progress, could see themselves reflected in the Titanic's construction. The ship's sinking, therefore, was not only a tragedy, it was a dramatic commentary on human confidence, hubris, and the fragile line between success and disaster. The vessel became, in essence, a mirror of societal ambition itself, a story of human potential both realized and catastrophically misjudged. The human stories aboard the Titanic contribute profoundly to its enduring appeal. Passengers from every social stratum, wealthy industrialists, middle-class travelers, and immigrants seeking a better life, experienced the same terror as the ship went down. Their experiences provide a microcosm of human society, capturing heroism, cowardice, love, sacrifice, and despair. Americans in particular have been drawn to narratives that highlight resilience, moral choice, and ethical conflict. Figures such as Captain Rustran of the RMS Carpathia, who navigated dangerous waters to rescue survivors, or ordinary passengers who displayed extraordinary courage, became icons of character and humanity. These stories resonate in a nation that values both individual initiative and collective heroism. The Titanic also embodies a fascination with class and social hierarchy, a theme that resonates strongly in American cultural consciousness. First-class passengers were afforded luxury and privilege, while those in steerage faced starkly different conditions. The tragedy exposed inequities in access to life-saving measures, raising ethical and moral questions that continue to captivate historians and the public alike. Americans, keenly aware of the country's own social divisions and aspirations toward equality, see in the Titanic both a reflection of social structures and a cautionary tale about human arrogance and the consequences of ignoring moral responsibility. Technological fascination further fuels the myth. The Titanic represented cutting-edge engineering, yet it was not impervious to nature's force. This juxtaposition of human mastery and vulnerability appeals to a culture that prizes innovation yet understands its limits. The vessel's sophisticated design, luxurious accommodations, and advanced communication systems, juxtaposed with the iceberg that rendered them useless, creates a compelling narrative tension. It is a story that Americans continue to explore through film, literature, museum exhibitions, and historical inquiry, drawn to the interplay between human ingenuity and nature's unpredictability. Moreover, the Titanic's myth is amplified by storytelling across media. From the early newspaper accounts of the disaster to contemporary films, documentaries, novels, and digital recreations, the ship has been immortalized in multiple forms. The 1997 film adaptation, in particular, brought the Titanic to the forefront of popular consciousness, blending historical fact with dramatized human experience. Audiences connected emotionally to the characters and their struggles, transforming the event into a shared cultural memory. Americans, fascinated by narratives that combine spectacle with moral and emotional depth, embraced the Titanic as both history and legend. The discovery of the wreck in 1985 by Robert Ballard added another layer to the myth. The haunting images of the bow, the scattered debris, and the preserved artifacts bridged the gap between imagination and reality. Americans, already captivated by stories and media portrayals, now had tangible evidence of the ship's existence, solidifying the Titanic's place in cultural memory. The discovery also enabled historians and filmmakers to reconstruct events with greater accuracy, deepening public engagement and reinforcing the narrative of both tragedy and heroism. The enduring myth also touches on the human desire to confront mortality and fragility. The Titanic's story is a reminder of life's unpredictability, the suddenness with which fortune can change, and the profound emotional impact of loss. Americans, often drawn to narratives that explore resilience, mortality, and moral choice, find in the Titanic both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection. The ship's descent into the ocean symbolizes the limits of human control, while the survival of individuals and acts of heroism highlight courage, ethics, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Memorialization and commemoration further sustain the myth. Museums, memorials, and exhibitions in both the United States and abroad celebrate the lives lost and the lessons learned. Artifacts recovered from the wreck are displayed with reverence, providing tactile connections to a past that is otherwise inaccessible. Public ceremonies, anniversaries, and educational programs keep the memory alive, ensuring that the Titanic remains not just an event in history, but an ongoing narrative with moral, cultural, and educational significance. Americans engage with the story not only as a historical account, but as a shared cultural experience that informs values, ethics, and collective memory. Finally, the Titanic's myth persists because it invites personal reflection. Each retelling, whether through film, literature, or oral history, allows audiences to imagine themselves aboard the ship, facing moral dilemmas, danger, and ethical choices. This immersive engagement transforms the historical event into a personal and emotional experience. Americans, in particular, respond to narratives that blend adventure, heroism, tragedy, and ethical reflection, and the Titanic provides all of these elements in abundance. The enduring appeal of the Titanic is thus multifaceted. It is a story of ambition and tragedy, technology and vulnerability, heroism and moral challenge. It captures imagination across generations, blending historical reality with cultural reflection. Americans continue to revisit the Titanic because it serves as both a mirror and a lesson, a reminder of human frailty, the potential for courage, and the importance of vigilance and foresight. It is a narrative that transcends time, offering both caution and inspiration, mourning and admiration. In the end, the Titanic's story is not merely about a ship, an iceberg, or a disaster. It is about humanity itself, its triumphs, its mistakes, its resilience, and its capacity for reflection. Americans, like the rest of the world, are drawn to it because it speaks to fundamental truths about life, society, and human endeavor. The ship may rest quietly on the ocean floor, but its story continues to sail across history, imagination, and memory, reminding each generation that progress and peril often travel together, and that the human spirit endures even in the face of the deepest darkness. As the sun sets over the Atlantic today, the Titanic lies silently in its cold, dark grave, a resting place for dreams, ambitions, and lives cut short. Yet its story continues, told in classrooms, on screens, and in hearts. The ship, lost but never forgotten, lives on in memory and myth, a testament to human courage, folly, and the enduring power of history to shape imagination. And in that enduring story lies a final truth. The Titanic, though it sank, will never truly be gone. The end.